The billionaire's voice cut through the restaurant's silence like a blade. "You're fired." Daniel Brooks, widowed father, invisible employee, a man who lived on the edge of exhaustion, felt the world tilt. He had $6 in his bank account, a 6-year-old daughter waiting at home, and rent due in 4 days. This wasn't just losing a job. This was losing everything. But instead of begging, instead of breaking, he looked into Victoria Langford's ice-cold eyes and said quietly, "If I've truly lost my job, please, don't let my daughter know." Something in Victoria's chest cracked open. What happens when power meets dignity, when a test meant to expose weakness instead reveals the tester's own emptiness? Stay with me until the end of this story, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The fluorescent lights of Meridian Tower's executive kitchen hummed their indifferent song at 11:47 p.m. Daniel Brooks moved through the industrial space with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that invisibility was survival. His hands, calloused, careful, plated the last dessert for the private dining event 43 floors above. A deconstructed tiramisu that cost more than his weekly grocery budget. He didn't think about that. Thinking about it made his chest tight. "Brooks," the sous chef's voice carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd worked 16 hours straight. "You're up. VIP floor. Table 8 needs immediate service." Daniel nodded, wiped his hands on his apron, and loaded the dessert onto the service cart. His reflection caught in the polished chrome. 31 years old, but his eyes looked older. Grief and exhaustion aged a person in ways that birthdays couldn't measure. The service elevator rose in silence. Daniel straightened his black vest, checked that his name tag sat level. These small rituals mattered. In a world of billionaires and board members, presentation was armor. As long as he looked professional, moved efficiently, and kept his head down, he could remain what he needed to be, unnoticed, unremarkable, employed. The elevator doors opened onto a different universe. Floor 43 existed in a realm of hushed luxury that made Daniel's modest Queens apartment feel like a different planet. Soft amber lighting, real plants that someone actually watered, art that probably cost more than his daughter's college fund, if he'd been able to start one. He pushed the cart toward table 8, located in a private alcove that overlooked Manhattan's glittering sprawl. A woman sat alone, her back to him, silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a conquest. "Your dessert, ma'am." Daniel's voice came out steady, professional. Years of service work had taught him the right tone. Present, but not intrusive. Helpful, but not familiar. The woman turned. Victoria Langford. Daniel's heart performed an uncomfortable stutter. He'd seen her before. Everyone who worked at Meridian Tower had seen her, but always from a distance, always in motion, always surrounded by executives who scrambled to keep pace with her razor-sharp decisions. She was the kind of beautiful that lived on magazine covers. Sharp cheekbones, slate-gray eyes that could dissect a quarterly report, or a human soul with equal precision, dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested control over every aspect of existence. She was also, according to breakroom gossip, utterly ruthless. "Thank you." Her voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone who'd never had to repeat herself. She didn't look at Daniel. Her gaze remained fixed on the tablet in front of her, fingers moving across the screen with decisive speed. Daniel placed the dessert, adjusted the positioning precisely, and began to retreat. "Wait." He froze. "Yes, ma'am?" Victoria's eyes lifted from the tablet, and for the first time she actually looked at him, really looked. Daniel felt suddenly exposed, as though those gray eyes could inventory every secret he carried, the unpaid medical bills shoved in his kitchen drawer, the holes in Lily's winter coat he kept meaning to patch, the exhaustion that lived in his bones like a second skeleton. "What's your name?" "Daniel Brooks, ma'am." "How long have you worked here, Daniel?" 2 years, ma'am, a little over." Victoria nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "I'm conducting a study, a psychological experiment, if you will. I want to understand how people respond under pressure, how character reveals itself when stability disappears." Something cold unfurled in Daniel's stomach. He said nothing, waiting. "So here's the situation." Victoria's voice remained perfectly level, almost clinical. "You're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. You have 10 minutes to collect your belongings. The world tilted. Daniel heard the words, understood their meaning, but his brain seemed to process them from a great distance. Fired. Immediately. 10 minutes. The phrases tumbled through his consciousness like stones down a cliff face, each impact creating new fractures. He had $6.43 in his checking account. Rent was due in 4 days, $1,847, for their one-bedroom apartment in Woodside, the place where Lily had taken her first steps, where Emma's books still lined a small shelf because Daniel couldn't bear to pack them away. His daughter's medication, the asthma inhaler she needed, the one that cost $280 without insurance, was running low. Without this job, without the health coverage it provided, without the steady paycheck that kept their fragile existence from collapsing. But Daniel had learned something in the 2 years since Emma's death. Panic was a luxury. Falling apart was a privilege reserved for people who had safety nets, savings accounts, someone to catch them. He'd used up all his braking when his wife's car had been hit by a drunk driver on a rainy October evening, when the hospital chaplain had said those devastating words, when he'd had to tell 6-year-old Lily that mommy wasn't coming home. Since then, he'd learned to function through catastrophe. "Ma'am," his voice came out steady. "May I ask what I did wrong? If there's been a complaint, I'd like the opportunity to address it." "There's been no complaint." Victoria's expression remained cool, almost curious. "Your performance has been adequate. This isn't about your work. It's about observing authentic human behavior under duress." Something flickered in Daniel's chest. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. She was testing him, using his life, his stability, his ability to feed and house his daughter as variables in some psychological experiment. To her, this was interesting. To him, it was oxygen. "I understand." The words felt like swallowing glass. "If this is truly my termination, I have one request." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Go on." "Please don't tell my daughter." Daniel's throat tightened, but he pushed through it. "When I get home tonight, I'll handle this. I'll figure something out. But Lily, she's 6 years old and she's already lost her mother. If she knows I've lost my job, that we're in trouble." He stopped, swallowed hard. "She worries about me, about us, more than a child should. So if this is real, if I'm truly being let go, please, just give me the chance to find a solution before she knows anything's wrong." For the first time since Daniel had entered the alcove, Victoria's expression shifted. Something flickered behind those gray eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something she hadn't expected to encounter. Silence stretched between them, heavy and strange. Victoria's hand, which had been resting on the table, slowly curled into a loose fist. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its clinical precision. "You have a daughter?" "Yes, ma'am." "And no other family?" "No, ma'am, it's just the two of us." Victoria stood abruptly, the movement sharp enough that Daniel instinctively took a small step back. She crossed to the window, her silhouette rigid against the city lights. For several long moments, she said nothing, just stared out at the Manhattan skyline, as though the buildings might offer answers to questions she hadn't asked aloud. When she turned back, her expression had shifted into something Daniel couldn't quite read. Not softer exactly, but less certain, less controlled. "You're not fired, Mr. Brooks." The relief that flooded through Daniel's body was so intense it felt almost painful. His knees went slightly weak, and he had to consciously lock them to stay upright. "Thank you, ma'am. It was a test." Victoria's voice had gone quiet. "A psychological experiment to observe how individuals respond to sudden, severe stress. I've been conducting these tests with various employees to gather data on authentic human behavior." She paused. "Your response was unexpected." Daniel said nothing. His heart was still hammering, adrenaline still coursing through his system like an electrical current. Most people, when faced with unexpected termination, respond with anger. Demands for explanation, threats of legal action, appeals to fairness or length of service. Victoria's eyes fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. "You didn't beg. You didn't protest your competence. Your first concern was protecting your daughter from knowledge of a crisis." "She's already been through enough," Daniel said quietly. Your wife. How long ago? 2 years, car accident. Victoria nodded slowly, and something in her expression suggested she was recalculating, reassessing. I apologize for the distress this experiment caused. That was not my intention, or rather, it was precisely my intention, but I'm beginning to question the ethics of my methodology. Daniel wanted to say that it was fine, that he understood, that no permanent harm had been done, but the words stuck in his throat, because it wasn't fine. For 3 minutes, he'd stood in front of this woman and watched his entire life collapse. For 3 minutes, he'd calculated how many days of Lily's medication they could afford, which bills could be delayed, whether his pride would survive asking his former coworkers for loans. "May I go, ma'am?" His voice came out more strained than he'd intended. "Yes, and Mr. Brooks?" Victoria's expression had gone unreadable again. "Thank you for your honesty. It's a rare quality." Daniel nodded, gripped the service cart's handle with hands that trembled slightly, and pushed it back toward the service elevator. He didn't run, that would have been unprofessional, but his pace was faster than usual, his movements less controlled. Behind him, Victoria Langford stood at the window of her private alcove, one hand pressed against the glass as though testing whether the barrier was real. Something had cracked inside her chest when Daniel Brooks had asked her not to tell his daughter. Some carefully constructed wall she'd spent 34 years building, brick by brick, taught by a father who believed that emotion was weakness and attachment was vulnerability, had developed a fissure. She'd conducted 17 of these psychological experiments over the past 6 months, testing employees across different departments and hierarchy levels. The pattern had been consistent: anger, protest, appeals to fairness, occasionally tears, predictable emotional responses that confirmed her father's teachings about human nature. But Daniel Brooks had done something different. He'd thought about someone else first. Victoria returned to her seat, but the quarterly projections on her tablet suddenly seemed impossibly distant. Her mind kept returning to the way Daniel's voice had gone rough when he mentioned his daughter, the way his hands had trembled slightly despite his outward calm, the quiet dignity with which he'd accepted what he believed to be catastrophe. She pulled up his employment file on her tablet. The information was sparse: hired 2 years ago, night shift kitchen staff, adequate performance reviews, no disciplinary issues. Current salary, $42,000 annually, single, 1 dependent. Victoria did the math automatically. After taxes, rent in Queens, childcare, basic living expenses for 2 people, he was surviving on nothing, less than nothing. And yet when faced with losing even that fragile stability, his first thought had been protecting his daughter from worry. Victoria's phone buzzed. Her assistant: "Board meeting moved to 8 a.m. tomorrow. Mr. Chen needs the Henderson acquisition analysis by midnight." She typed a response, closed the file on Daniel Brooks, and returned her attention to the work that never ended. But something had shifted. Some assumption she'd held about the world, about people, about what mattered, had been quietly undermined. 43 floors below, Daniel Brooks stepped out of Meridian Tower into the November cold. His shift ended at midnight, which gave him 6 hours of sleep before he had to get Lily ready for school, then crash for another 3 hours before his evening shift started again at 4. The subway ride to Queens passed in a blur of exhaustion and residual adrenaline. Daniel stared at his reflection in the dark window, watching the tunnel light strobe across his face. "You're not fired." The words played on repeat in his mind, a prayer he hadn't known he'd been saying. He climbed the 3 flights to their apartment, unlocked the door as quietly as possible. Mrs. Chen from 3B was asleep on their couch, the elderly neighbor who watched Lily on his night shifts, who refused payment but accepted the groceries Daniel brought her, the meals he cooked in bulk so she wouldn't have to. "Daniel." She woke immediately, her voice soft. "Lily's asleep. She had a good evening, finished her homework, ate all her dinner." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen, really." The old woman studied his face with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by polite masks. "You look tired." "Always tired," Daniel said with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. After Mrs. Chen left, Daniel moved through the apartment's familiar darkness to Lily's room. His daughter slept curled on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, her dark hair fanned across the pillow. Emma's hair. Emma's sleeping position. The resemblance was simultaneously comforting and devastating. Daniel sat carefully on the edge of the bed, watching Lily's chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of child sleep. She looked peaceful, unburdened. That peace was worth everything, worth the exhaustion, the anxiety, the 20-hour days, the constant calculation of pennies and priorities. "I've got you, baby girl," he whispered. "I promise. I've got you." Lily stirred slightly but didn't wake. Daniel stood, pulled her blanket up a little higher, and retreated to the living room. He had 3 hours before he needed to sleep. He spent them the way he spent most nights, researching better-paying jobs he wasn't qualified for, updating a resume that looked increasingly desperate, and trying not to calculate how many more months they could survive before something essential broke. At 3:47 a.m., he finally collapsed into bed. At 6:30 a.m., his alarm shrieked him back to consciousness. The cycle continued. And for the next 2 weeks, Victoria Langford found herself thinking about Daniel Brooks with uncomfortable frequency. It was irrational. She'd conducted a psychological experiment, gathered her data, and should have moved on. But something about his response had lodged itself in her consciousness like a splinter she couldn't extract. She began noticing him during her occasional late-night tours of the building. Meridian Tower was her empire. 30 floors of financial power she'd built through ruthless efficiency and strategic brilliance. Her father, Richard Langford, had taught her young. Emotion was liability, attachment was weakness. Compassion was the indulgence of people who couldn't afford to win. "You want to be successful, Victoria?" he'd said when she was 12, watching her cry over a hamster that had died. "Then understand this. Everything dies. Everything leaves. The only thing you can trust is your own strength, your own mind, your own ability to survive alone." She'd internalized those lessons completely. At Harvard Business School, while her classmates formed study groups and friendships, Victoria had worked alone. In her 20s, while her peers dated and married, she'd built her first company. By 30, she'd sold it for 9 figures. By 33, she'd taken over Meridian Capital and tripled its value. Success. Exactly as her father had promised. But lately, especially since the night with Daniel Brooks, Victoria had started wondering whether success and survival were the same thing. She found herself observing him during those late-night building tours. He moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, never wasting motion, never drawing attention. He was always the first to arrive for his shift and the last to leave. He never complained, never gossiped with the other kitchen staff, never took unauthorized breaks. And he was exhausted. Victoria could see it in the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching, in the shadows under his eyes that makeup couldn't conceal, in the careful way he moved, as though his body was held together by willpower and determination rather than actual energy. One Thursday evening, she made a decision that surprised even herself. "Thompson," she called her personal assistant. "I want a full background check on one of our kitchen staff, Daniel Brooks. Employment history, financial situation, personal circumstances, everything." "Of course, Ms. Langford. May I ask the purpose?" "Research," Victoria said, which was technically true. "I'm evaluating employee welfare protocols." The report arrived the next morning. Victoria read it in her office, coffee growing cold beside her keyboard. The details painted a picture she'd already half assembled. Daniel Brooks, 31, widowed at 29. Wife Emma Brooks, killed by a drunk driver. One daughter, Lily Brooks, age 6. Current residence, 1-bedroom apartment in Woodside, Queens. Annual income, $42,000. Debt, $47,000 in medical bills from his wife's accident and final hospitalization, currently in a payment plan of $200 monthly. Savings, less than $1,000. Recent credit activity, none. He apparently lived entirely on cash and debit. The man was drowning, and he'd done it so quietly that no one had noticed. Victoria closed the file and sat back in her chair, staring at the Manhattan skyline without really seeing it. What was she supposed to do with this information? She wasn't a charity. Meridian Capital succeeded because she made hard decisions, because she prioritized efficiency over sentiment, because she understood that business was survival of the fittest. But Daniel Brooks' voice kept echoing in her memory. "Please don't tell my daughter." That weekend, Victoria did something she almost never did. She left work before midnight. She drove to Queens, not in her usual town car with driver, but in her personal Tesla, following GPS directions to an address she'd memorized from Daniel's file. The neighborhood was working class, tired-looking buildings that had seen better decades. Children played on a small, cracked playground. A bodega on the corner advertised "WAC accepted." This was a world Victoria had studied in economics textbooks but never actually inhabited. She sat in her car across from Daniel's building, feeling increasingly foolish. What was she doing here? What had she expected to accomplish? Then the building door opened, and Daniel emerged with a small girl. Lily. Victoria's breath caught. The child was tiny, dark-haired, with her father's gentle features. She wore a puffy coat that was slightly too large, probably purchased with room to grow, and bright purple boots. She was talking animatedly, her small hands gesturing as she told some elaborate story. Daniel listened with complete attention, nodding seriously, occasionally smiling at whatever narrative his daughter was constructing. Then Lily stumbled slightly on the uneven sidewalk. Daniel's reaction was instantaneous. He caught her before she could fall, then knelt down to her level, checking her knees through her jeans, asking questions Victoria couldn't hear. Lily laughed. Apparently she was fine. But Daniel still took an extra moment, brushing imaginary dirt from her coat, making sure she was steady before they continued walking. The tenderness in that gesture hit Victoria like a physical blow. This was what love looked like. Not the abstract concept she'd read about in literature or studied in psychology courses, but the lived reality. An exhausted man kneeling on a cracked sidewalk, making sure his daughter's knees were okay, prioritizing her comfort over the cold seeping through his jeans. Victoria had built an empire. She had power, wealth, influence that could reshape markets. But watching Daniel Brooks check his daughter's knees, she realized she'd never built anything that mattered like this. She started her car and drove back to Manhattan, her hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, her chest feeling strange, tight and loose simultaneously, as though something inside her was trying to break free from constraints she'd spent decades constructing. Monday morning, Victoria called an emergency meeting with her director of human resources. "I want to review our employee welfare programs," she said, specifically support for single parents, access to childcare, health insurance coverage, and wage adequacy for cost of living in New York. Her HR director, Margaret Chen, looked surprised but pleased. "That's wonderful, Ms. Langford. We've been meaning to audit those programs for. I want the review completed in 2 weeks. And I want specific recommendations for improvements, including budgetary requirements. Of course, may I ask what prompted this initiative?" Victoria's expression remained carefully neutral. "It's good business to ensure our employees aren't distracted by preventable financial stress. Productivity suffers when people are worried about basic survival." It was a perfectly logical explanation. It was also completely insufficient for what Victoria was actually feeling. Over the following weeks, she found herself implementing changes, expanded health coverage, emergency childcare services, a salary review that resulted in raises for lower-tier employees. The board questioned some of her decisions. Since when do we prioritize charity over profit margins? But Victoria pushed through using arguments about employee retention and productivity metrics. She didn't mention that she'd started calculating whether Daniel Brooks's raise would cover his daughter's medication, whether the new childcare program would ease his impossible schedule, whether these systematic changes might make one man's life incrementally less precarious. She didn't mention that she watched the kitchen staff roster obsessively, noting when Daniel called in sick, twice in 3 months, tracking his consistent overtime, his perfect attendance record. She definitely didn't mention that she'd started manufacturing excuses to visit the 43rd floor dining room on evenings when his shift overlapped with her late-night work sessions. One Thursday in December, Victoria was reviewing acquisition targets in her usual alcove when Daniel delivered her dinner: grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, the kind of healthy meal her personal nutritionist recommended, and she usually ignored in favor of working through dinner entirely. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks." She used his name deliberately now, a small acknowledgement of his humanity that felt both necessary and insufficient. "You're welcome, Ms. Langford." He began to retreat, as always. "Wait." The word escaped before Victoria had consciously decided to speak. Daniel turned back, polite inquiry in his expression. How is... Victoria stopped, recalibrated. This was too personal, too revealing. How are you finding the recent policy changes? The health insurance expansion, the new scheduling flexibility? Something flickered in Daniel's expression, surprise maybe, that she'd even noticed such details. They've been helpful, ma'am. Very helpful. Good. Victoria nodded. That's the goal. Employee welfare directly impacts productivity and retention. Another perfectly logical explanation for actions that felt increasingly inadequate to their motivation. Daniel hesitated, and for a moment Victoria thought he might say something more. But then he simply nodded, said, "Enjoy your meal, ma'am," and left. Victoria stared at the salmon, no longer hungry. What was she doing? What was this strange pull she felt toward a man she barely knew? It wasn't attraction, or not only attraction. It was something more unsettling, recognition, as though Daniel Brooks' quiet dignity, his exhausted devotion to his daughter, his refusal to break under pressure, had exposed something Victoria had spent her entire life avoiding. The possibility that her father had been wrong, that survival alone wasn't enough, that strength without connection was just another word for loneliness. Victoria pushed the thought away, returned to her acquisition analysis, and worked until 2 a.m. But even as she reviewed financial projections and market trends, part of her consciousness remained fixed on a question she couldn't quite articulate. What did it mean to build something that actually mattered? 3 floors below, Daniel Brooks cleaned the industrial kitchen with methodical precision, loaded the dishwasher, and wiped down stainless steel surfaces until they gleamed under fluorescent lights. His new salary, increased by 18% in the recent company-wide adjustment, meant he could finally afford Lily's asthma medication without choosing between that and groceries. The expanded health insurance meant her routine checkups were fully covered. The new emergency childcare program meant he'd stopped living in constant fear of Mrs. Chen getting sick and his entire support system collapsing. Things were incrementally better, but Daniel was still exhausted, still surviving rather than living, still moving through each day with the grim determination of someone who'd learned that survival was a full-time job with no vacation time. He thought sometimes about the night Victoria Langford had told him he was fired, about the 3 minutes when his entire world had balanced on a knife's edge. The memory still made his chest tight, his hands shake slightly. But lately, he'd also been thinking about her apology, about the strange expression on her face when he'd asked her not to tell Lily, about the way she sometimes watched him during his shifts with an intensity that felt less like observation and more like, what? Confusion? Recognition? Regret? Daniel didn't have the energy to decode the interior life of a billionaire. He had enough trouble navigating his own existence. At 12:47 a.m., he clocked out, caught the subway to Queens, and climbed 3 flights to the apartment where his daughter slept, and the life he'd built from grief waited patiently for him to come home. Tomorrow, he would do it all again. Tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Survival, he'd learned, was a practice of infinite repetition. What Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 43 floors above, Victoria Langford stood at her office window, staring at the city lights, and wondered whether the empire she'd built was actually just an elaborate monument to loneliness. Something was shifting inside her, something her father's teachings hadn't prepared her for. And it had started with a quiet man in a service uniform who'd asked her not to tell his daughter about a crisis that hadn't been real. Victoria pressed one hand against the cold glass and allowed herself, for the first time in memory, to feel the full weight of her isolation. It was crushing. The glass felt like ice beneath Victoria's palm, but she didn't pull her hand away. Below, Manhattan glittered with the kind of beauty that money could buy but never truly possess. 1 billion points of light marking lives she'd never touch, stories she'd never know, connections she'd systematically avoided for 34 years. Her phone buzzed. Another acquisition alert, another opportunity to expand her empire. Victoria silenced it without looking. Something had broken inside her the night she'd told Daniel Brooks he was fired. Or maybe something had finally started working, some mechanism her father had carefully disabled, some capacity for feeling that she'd believed was weakness, but was beginning to suspect might be the only thing that made life bearable. She drove home to her penthouse in Tribeca, rode the private elevator to the 30th floor, and entered 6,000 square feet of designer emptiness. The space had been featured in Architectural Digest, floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, art that appreciated in value while she slept. Everything curated, nothing personal, all of it screaming success in the particular language of people who'd convinced themselves that loneliness was just another word for independence. Victoria poured herself 2 fingers of scotch, 18-year-old single malt that cost more than Daniel's weekly salary, and stood at her own window, looking down at a different angle of the same indifferent city. Her father would have been disgusted by what she was feeling. Richard Langford had built his fortune on the principle that sentiment was suicide, that successful people understood the fundamental truth. You were born alone, you died alone, and everything in between was just elaborate pretending. The world doesn't care about your feelings, Victoria, he'd told her when she was 16, crying over a boy who dumped her before prom. It cares about results. Winners survive because they understand that attachment is optional. It's a choice weak people make because they're afraid of their own strength. She'd believed him completely, had structured her entire existence around that philosophy. And it had worked. She'd achieved everything she'd set out to accomplish. Power, wealth, respect from people who feared her too much to actually like her. But watching Daniel Brooks check his daughter's knees on a cracked sidewalk had revealed something her father had never mentioned. Maybe survival wasn't the same thing as living. Victoria finished her scotch, set the glass down with too much force, and made a decision. She was going to do something monumentally stupid. The next morning, she called Margaret Chen again. "I want a complete operational review of our facilities management," Victoria said. "Specifically the kitchen and service departments. I want to understand workflow efficiency, employee satisfaction metrics, and identify high-performing individuals who might benefit from advancement opportunities." Margaret's voice came through the speaker with barely concealed surprise. "Ms. Langford, we've never conducted that kind of granular review for support staff positions. The turnover in those departments is relatively low, and the cost-benefit analysis—" "I'm not asking for an analysis, Margaret. I'm telling you to conduct the review." "Of course. Timeline?" 2 weeks. Victoria ended the call and sat back in her chair, her heart beating faster than the situation warranted. What was she doing? Creating elaborate corporate justifications to pay attention to one exhausted single father? This was insane. This was the kind of decision-making that destroyed businesses and careers. But she couldn't seem to stop herself. Over the following days, Victoria found herself manufacturing increasingly transparent excuses to observe the kitchen operations. She scheduled meetings on the 43rd floor during Daniel's evening shifts. She reviewed food service reports that had previously been far below her attention level. She even attended a facilities management meeting, something she hadn't done in 3 years, and listened to discussions about industrial dishwasher maintenance with an attentiveness that clearly confused everyone present. And she watched Daniel. He was remarkable in his consistency. He arrived precisely 15 minutes before his shift, prepared his station with methodical care, and moved through service with quiet efficiency. He never complained, never cut corners, never participated in the casual griping that characterized most workplace environments. He just worked, hour after hour, with the kind of steady determination that suggested he'd long ago accepted that life wasn't about happiness. It was about endurance. But Victoria also began noticing the cracks in his armor, the way his hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was watching, the careful way he moved, as though his body hurt but he'd learned to ignore it, the shadows under his eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal, the way he occasionally closed his eyes for just a moment, as though gathering strength for the next task. He was breaking. Slowly, quietly, but definitely breaking. Victoria knew that kind of breaking. She'd seen it in the mirror during her 20s when she'd built her first company. The exhaustion that went so deep it became personality. The grim acceptance that rest was for people who could afford it. The constant calculation of what could be sacrificed to keep moving forward. She'd survived it because she'd had resources, family money, safety nets, the privilege of knowing that if she failed, she wouldn't be homeless. She'd also survived it because she'd had nothing to protect except her own ambition. Daniel was doing it while raising a child alone. The realization hit Victoria during a Thursday evening in late December. She was in her usual alcove, ostensibly reviewing quarterly projections, but actually watching the kitchen entrance, waiting for Daniel's shift to start. When he finally appeared, 8 minutes early, as always, something in his movement made her breath catch. He was limping, slightly, carefully, trying to conceal it, but definitely limping. Victoria watched him prepare his station, noting the way he favored his left leg, the occasional grimace that crossed his face when he thought no one was looking. An injury, probably. Something that should have been treated but wasn't, because he couldn't afford to miss work. Couldn't afford the medical attention, couldn't afford to be anything except functional. Her chest felt tight. At 9:47 p.m., Victoria made a decision that would have horrified her 6 months ago. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked directly to the kitchen. The space was chaos. Organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Steam, noise, the clatter of industrial cookware, staff calling orders and confirmations in the shorthand of people who'd worked together long enough to develop their own language. Victoria had never been in the actual working kitchen before. She existed on the other side of the service window, in the realm where food appeared perfectly plated, where the violence of its creation remained invisible. Daniel saw her first. His expression went carefully neutral, the practiced blankness of service workers who'd learned that visibility meant vulnerability. "Miss Langford, is something wrong with your order?" Every eye in the kitchen turned toward them. Conversations died. Even the sous chef, a heavy-set man named Marcus who'd worked at Meridian for 12 years, stopped mid-instruction to stare. Victoria felt suddenly, intensely out of place. This wasn't her territory. These weren't her people. She was the CEO, the distant authority figure, the name on policies and paychecks, but not part of the actual machinery that made the building function. "Nothing's wrong," she said, forcing her voice to remain level. "Mr. Brooks, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" The silence in the kitchen became charged with speculation. Daniel's carefully neutral expression didn't shift, but something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, maybe, or concern. "Of course, ma'am." "Marcus, I'll be back in 5 minutes." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze moving between Victoria and Daniel with the kind of assessment that suggested he was already constructing a narrative for the break room gossip circuit. Victoria led Daniel out of the kitchen into a small service hallway, the kind of anonymous space that existed in every building, connecting the public-facing areas to the machinery that maintained them. Here, away from audiences, she could see the strain in Daniel's posture more clearly, the way he held his weight on his right leg, the tension in his shoulders. "You're injured," Victoria said. Daniel blinked. "Ma'am?" "Your left leg. You're favoring it. What happened?" For a moment, Daniel seemed to be calculating whether honesty was more dangerous than deflection. Finally, he said, "I twisted my ankle last week. It's fine. I can work." "Have you seen a doctor?" "It's just a sprain, ma'am. It'll heal on its own." "That's not what I asked." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No, ma'am. I haven't seen a doctor." "Why not?" The question hung between them, and Victoria watched something shift in Daniel's expression. A flash of frustration, quickly suppressed, followed by resignation. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its professional neutrality. "Because a doctor's visit costs $150 even with insurance. Because the x-ray they'd want to rule out a fracture is another $200. Because if they prescribe physical therapy, that's $75 per session, and insurance only covers 10 sessions annually. Because I've already used 8 of those sessions this year when I pulled a muscle in my back." He stopped, seemed to realize he was saying too much. "It's just a sprain, ma'am. I'll be fine." Victoria felt something twist in her chest. She'd known abstractly that healthcare in America was complicated, that people made difficult choices between treatment and cost. But standing in this anonymous hallway with a man who was literally working through an injury because he couldn't afford medical care, the abstraction became viciously real. "I'll send you to our corporate medical clinic," she said. "It's covered fully by the company. No copay, no deductible." "Ma'am, I appreciate that, but I really can't take time off right now. We're short-staffed, and—" "That's not a request, Mr. Brooks." Victoria's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. She softened it deliberately. "Consider it a direct order from the CEO. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. I'll have my assistant send you the address. Daniel studied her face with an intensity that made Victoria feel uncomfortably exposed. What did he see? A billionaire playing at benevolence? Someone trying to ease her guilt over that psychological experiment? Or something else? Something Victoria wasn't ready to name, even to herself? Why? Daniel asked quietly. Because employees working through injuries is a liability issue. The lie came easily, polished by years of corporate training. That's not why. Victoria's breath caught. No one challenged her like this. No one questioned her explanations or demanded transparency from her. She was Victoria Langford. People accepted what she said or found themselves unemployed. But Daniel wasn't being insubordinate. He was just looking at her, really looking. The way he'd looked at her that night when she told him he was fired, when his entire world was collapsing but he'd still had enough presence of mind to think about his daughter first. No, Victoria admitted. That's not why. Then why? Because I watched you check your daughter's knees on a sidewalk and realized I've built my entire life on a philosophy that makes survival possible but living unbearable. Because you asked me not to tell your child about a crisis I'd manufactured, and something in my chest cracked open that I don't know how to seal back shut. Because I'm 34 years old and I've never once in my life put someone else's well-being above my own strategic advantage, and the novelty of that desire is terrifying. Victoria said none of those things. Because it's the right thing to do, she said instead. Which was true, even if it was wildly insufficient. Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he also didn't push further. 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'll be there. Good. Victoria straightened her shoulders, reassembling her professional armor. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. She turned to leave, but Daniel's voice stopped her. Miss Langford? Yes? Thank you. His voice carried something beyond professional gratitude, something softer, more genuine. Really, thank you. Victoria nodded without turning around and walked back toward the elevator with her heart beating too fast, and her carefully constructed emotional distance feeling increasingly like a prison rather than protection. Behind her, Daniel stood in the service hallway for a long moment before returning to the kitchen, where Marcus and the rest of the staff immediately descended with questions that Daniel deflected with practiced ease. But inside, beneath his calm exterior, something had shifted. Victoria Langford had noticed him, not as an employee number or a line item in a budget, but as a human being. She'd seen him limping and cared enough to intervene. She'd bypassed corporate protocol and hierarchical distance to make sure he received medical care. It was the kind of attention Daniel had learned not to expect from the world. After Emma died, he discovered that grief made people uncomfortable. Friends had gradually stopped calling. Emma's family, never particularly close, had sent a check and then disappeared back into their own lives. Even well-meaning neighbors eventually tired of offering help that Daniel was too proud or too exhausted to accept. He'd learned to be invisible, to need nothing, to survive on determination and discipline because counting on other people was a luxury he couldn't afford. But Victoria had seen him anyway. Daniel finished his shift, caught the midnight subway to Queens, and climbed the familiar 3 flights to his apartment. Mrs. Chen had left a note. Lily asleep by 9. Ate all her dinner, sweet dreams. He found his daughter exactly where he'd left her 12 hours ago. In her small bedroom with its walls covered in drawings she'd made, its shelves holding the few toys and books their budget allowed. Lily slept with her favorite stuffed elephant tucked under one arm, her dark hair spread across the pillow in a way that looked so much like Emma that Daniel's throat tightened. I met someone today, he whispered, even though Lily couldn't hear him. Someone who saw me. I don't know what that means yet, but it felt different. Lily stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Daniel kissed her forehead, retreated to the living room, and collapsed onto the second-hand couch that sagged in the middle from years of use. His ankle throbbed. He'd been standing on it for 8 hours straight, and exhaustion pressed down on him like a physical weight. But beneath the exhaustion, something else flickered, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The next morning, Daniel dropped Lily at school and took the train to the address Victoria's assistant had sent, a medical clinic in Midtown that occupied the ground floor of a gleaming tower. The space looked more like a luxury hotel than a healthcare facility. Warm lighting, comfortable seating, abstract art on walls painted in soothing neutrals. Daniel Brooks, he told the receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes and efficient movements. I have a 9 o'clock appointment. She typed something, nodded. Yes, Mr. Brooks. Ms. Langford's office called ahead. You're all set. Dr. Martinez will see you shortly. Daniel sat in the waiting area, feeling distinctly out of place among the polished professionals who populated the space. He was still in his work clothes, clean but worn, functional but obviously budget-constrained. His coat had a patch on one elbow where Lily had spilled hot chocolate last winter. Mr. Brooks, a woman in her 40s wearing scrubs and a warm smile, gestured him toward an examination room. Dr. Martinez had the kind of competent calm that suggested she'd seen everything and was unimpressed by status, wealth, or corporate hierarchies. Let's take a look at that ankle, she said after introductions and the standard medical history questions. How did this happen? Slipped on some ice outside my building. Stupid accident. When? 8 days ago. Dr. Martinez's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she'd already cataloged the implications. 8 days of working on an injury, 8 days without treatment, 8 days of choosing rent and food over medical care. She examined his ankle with gentle efficiency, asked him to rotate it, flex it, put weight on it. Then she sent him for an X-ray with a technician who looked about 17 and called him Sir with the kind of earnest respect that made Daniel feel approximately 90 years old. 20 minutes later, Dr. Martinez studied the results. Good news, no fracture. Bad news, it's a grade 2 sprain, which means you've got some ligament damage. You should have been off it for at least a week. Instead, you've been standing on it for... She checked his file. 8-hour shifts? Sometimes 10, Daniel admitted. Right. So what you've done is taken an injury that should have healed in 2 weeks and extended it to probably 6. You need rest, ice, compression, elevation. You need to actually stay off it as much as possible. And you need physical therapy to make sure the ligaments heal properly. She looked at him directly. Can you do that? Daniel thought about his rent, his bills, Lily's medication, the precarious math that constituted their survival. I can't afford to miss work. Mr. Brooks, if you don't rest this ankle properly, you're going to cause permanent damage, chronic instability, recurring sprains, potentially arthritis down the line. You're 31. Do you want to be dealing with this for the next 50 years? No, ma'am? Then listen to me. I'm writing you a medical note for 1 week of modified duty, light activity only, mostly sitting, absolutely no 8-hour standing shifts. I'm also prescribing physical therapy twice a week for 6 weeks, and that's covered fully by your company's medical benefits, no copay. You come back in 3 weeks for a follow-up, and we'll assess progress. She paused. This isn't optional, Mr. Brooks. This is your body telling you that you can't keep pushing through everything. Daniel nodded, taking the paper she handed him. The medical note, the physical therapy referral, care instructions printed on crisp white paper that smelled like laser toner and corporate efficiency. Thank you, Dr. Martinez. Don't thank me. Thank whoever sent you here. Most people in your situation don't get this kind of care. Daniel left the clinic with a walking boot strapped around his ankle and a strange feeling in his chest. Someone had intervened. Someone had noticed him struggling and done something about it. That someone was a billionaire CEO who'd once told him he was fired as a psychological experiment, who existed in a completely different universe of wealth and power, who had absolutely no reason to care whether a night shift kitchen worker had a sprained ankle. And yet she'd cared anyway. Daniel didn't know what to do with that information. He spent the rest of the day in a liminal space between shifts, too awake to sleep, too exhausted to be productive. He picked Lily up from school, made her favorite dinner, spaghetti with butter and parmesan, the kind of simple food that spoke to childhood comfort, and listened to her elaborate stories about recess politics and the apparent social complexity of first-grade friendships. Emma said I couldn't play princess because I didn't have the right shoes, Lily reported with the kind of serious concern that suggested this was a legitimate crisis. But then Maya said that was mean, and anyone could be a princess regardless of shoes. So we played, and Emma got mad and went to play with different people. Sounds like Maya's a good friend, Daniel said. She is. She shares her snacks. Lily twirled spaghetti around her fork with the intense concentration of a 6-year-old navigating complex motor skills. Daddy, why do you have that thing on your foot? I hurt my ankle. The doctor gave me this boot to help it heal. Does it hurt? A little, but I'm okay, baby girl. Lily studied him with eyes that were too perceptive for her age. You always say you're okay. Daniel's throat tightened. His daughter was 6 years old. She shouldn't have to worry about whether her father was okay. She shouldn't have to carry that awareness, that concern, that premature understanding that adults weren't invincible. I am okay, he said gently. I promise. This boot is going to help me get better faster. Lily seemed to accept this, returning her attention to her spaghetti. But Daniel saw the way she watched him throughout dinner, the small furrow between her eyebrows that appeared when she was worrying about something, the way she stayed extra close when they settled on the couch afterward for their nightly reading ritual. She'd lost her mother. Of course, she was worried about losing her father, too. Hey, Daniel pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. I'm not going anywhere, Lily. I promise. I've got you, and you've got me, and we're going to be just fine. Forever? Her voice was small. Forever, Daniel said, making a promise he had no guarantee he could keep, but would die trying to honor. That night, after Lily was asleep, Daniel sat at their small kitchen table with the medical paperwork spread in front of him, the physical therapy referral, the modified duty note, the care instructions that assumed he had time for rest, ice, compression, elevation, the luxury of recovery. He thought about Victoria Langford standing in that service hallway, asking why he hadn't seen a doctor, cutting through his deflection with uncomfortable directness. He thought about the way she'd looked at him, not with pity exactly, but with something that felt like recognition, as though she understood what it meant to push through pain because stopping wasn't an option, as though she saw in him something that mattered beyond his function as an employee. Daniel didn't know what to do with that scene. He'd spent 2 years being invisible, and visibility felt dangerous. It meant people noticed when you struggled. It meant vulnerability. It meant the possibility of disappointment when they inevitably stopped caring. But it also meant, for the first time since Emma died, that he wasn't entirely alone. And that terrified him almost as much as it comforted him. 43 floors above Manhattan, Victoria Langford stood at her office window and wondered whether she'd just made a strategic error or the first genuinely human decision of her adult life. She'd noticed Daniel Brooks limping and couldn't ignore it. She'd sent him to her corporate clinic and paid attention to whether he'd actually gone. She'd made sure his modified duty note was processed without question, had personally called Marcus to ensure Daniel's shifts were adjusted without penalty. She was involving herself, caring, making decisions based on emotion rather than efficiency. Her father would have been disgusted. But watching the city lights blur together in the December darkness, Victoria realized she didn't care what her father would have thought. She was tired of surviving. She wanted to know what living felt like. And somehow, impossibly, a quiet man in a walking boot who asked her not to tell his daughter about crises had become the catalyst for that wanting. Victoria pressed her palm against the cold glass and allowed herself to feel the full, terrifying weight of caring about another human being. It was going to change everything. She kept her hand against the glass for another moment, then pulled away, the coldness lingering on her palm like a brand. The city below offered no answers, just its indifferent glitter, and Victoria turned back to her desk where quarterly reports waited with the patience of numbers that never cared about the people behind them. But she couldn't focus. The spreadsheets blurred. The acquisition targets felt suddenly meaningless. All she could think about was Daniel Brooks sitting in her corporate clinic, finally getting treatment for an injury he'd been working through for over a week because healthcare was something he had to ration like food. Her intercom buzzed. Ms. Langford, your father is on line 2. Victoria's stomach tightened. Richard Langford called exactly twice a month, always unannounced, always expecting immediate availability. These weren't conversations, they were inspections. Opportunities for him to assess whether his daughter was maintaining the standards he'd instilled, whether she was staying strong or sliding into the weakness he'd spent her entire childhood warning her about. She picked up the phone. Hello, Father? Victoria, I've been reviewing Meridian's third quarter performance. No greeting, no small talk. Richard Langford didn't waste time on pleasantries. The numbers are adequate, but I'm concerned about some of your recent operational decisions. Which decisions? The wage increases across lower-tier positions, the expanded benefits package, the new childcare initiative. These aren't investments that show clear ROI, and the board is starting to notice. Of course, he'd been monitoring her decisions. Richard Langford had officially retired 5 years ago, but he maintained enough connections and strategic relationships to keep tabs on his daughter's company. Victoria had always known this, had always felt his presence hovering over her choices like a ghost that refused to die. Employee welfare directly impacts productivity and retention, Victoria said, repeating the justification she'd given the board. The long-term benefits outweigh the short-term costs. That's consultant speak, Victoria. I taught you better than that. Her father's voice carried the particular disappointment he reserved for moments when she failed to meet his exacting standards. You don't build empires by coddling employees. You build them by making hard choices, by understanding that business is war and sentiment is surrender. Maybe I'm tired of being at war. The words escaped before Victoria could stop them. Silence stretched across the phone line. Heavy, dangerous silence that reminded her of being 12 years old and saying something her father deemed unacceptably soft. Explain that statement, Richard finally said, his voice gone cold. Victoria could retreat. She could laugh it off, claim exhaustion, return to the script they'd followed for 3 decades. But something in her, something that had cracked open the night Daniel Brooks asked her not to tell his daughter about a manufactured crisis, refused to back down. I mean, that I've spent my entire life following your philosophy, and I'm starting to wonder if survival and success are the same thing. I've built everything you told me to build. I have power, wealth, respect, but I'm also alone, Father, completely alone. And lately I've been asking myself whether that was the goal or just the inevitable consequence of treating human connection like a liability. You're being emotional. Yes, I am. Victoria. Her father's voice sharpened. Listen to me carefully. I raised you to be strong because the world doesn't care about your feelings. I taught you to prioritize power because that's what protects you when everything else fails. Do you know what happens to people who lead with emotion? They get exploited. They get betrayed. They wake up one day and realize that everyone they trusted was just using them. Or maybe they wake up one day and realize they actually have something worth waking up for. Who is this about? Richard's question came fast, tactical. You've met someone. Victoria's breath caught. Her father's ability to read people, to identify weakness and exploit it, hadn't diminished with age. This isn't about anyone. This is about me questioning whether the way I've been living is actually sustainable. It's sustainable because it's rational. Emotion is temporary, Victoria. Power is permanent. I taught you that. You taught me a lot of things, Father, but you never taught me how to be happy. The words hung in the air between them, an accusation Victoria had never voiced in 34 years of being her father's daughter. Happiness? Richard's laugh was short, bitter. Happiness is what weak people pursue when they're afraid of excellence. You want to be happy? Get a cat, bake cookies, join a book club. But don't pretend those things have anything to do with building the kind of legacy that matters. What if the legacy that matters isn't the empire I build? What if it's whether I actually connected with another human being? What if the measure of a life isn't what you achieve, but whether anyone will genuinely miss you when you're gone? Silence again, longer this time. When Richard spoke, his voice carried something Victoria had rarely heard from him, genuine confusion. Where is this coming from? You've never talked like this before. Maybe I'm finally admitting what I've always felt, that your philosophy kept me alive but never let me live, that surviving alone isn't actually strength, it's just elaborate, socially acceptable suicide. You're making a mistake, Victoria. Whatever's causing this crisis of confidence, whatever person or situation has convinced you that emotion is wisdom, you need to step back and remember who you are. You're my daughter. You're strong. Don't throw that away chasing some fantasy of connection that will inevitably disappoint you. Victoria closed her eyes. Part of her wanted to believe him. Her father's worldview was simple, clear, unambiguous. Follow the rules, maintain control, never let anyone close enough to hurt you. It was a philosophy that had protected her from betrayal, heartbreak, the messy complications of authentic human relationship. It had also left her standing alone in a 6,000 square foot penthouse, at midnight, wondering whether she'd built a life or just an elaborate monument to fear. "I have to go, Father. Board meeting early tomorrow." "Victoria." She hung up before he could finish, her hand trembling slightly as she set the phone down. Her father would be furious. Richard Langford didn't get hung up on, but Victoria felt something that approximated relief, as though cutting off that conversation had also severed something larger, some invisible cord that had kept her tethered to a version of herself she was no longer certain she wanted to be. She gathered her things, left the office, and drove home through streets that looked different somehow. Softer. Less like territory to be conquered, and more like space where actual human beings lived actual lives. 3 days later, Victoria found herself doing something she'd never done in her entire tenure as CEO, visiting the facility's break room during a shift change. The space was utilitarian: beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a microwave that had seen better decades, round tables with plastic chairs that probably dated back to the building's original construction. Staff members sat in small clusters, eating meals brought from home, scrolling through phones, existing in that liminal space between work and whatever passed for rest in their lives. Conversations died when Victoria entered. Every eye turned toward her with the kind of wary attention people reserved for unexpected authority. She was the CEO. She existed on the 43rd floor, not down here in the machinery spaces where the actual work happened. "Please, continue. I'm just observing." Victoria tried for casual and landed somewhere in the vicinity of awkward. She'd spent years perfecting boardroom intimidation, but had zero experience with genuine informal human interaction. The conversations resumed, but quieter now, more careful. Victoria stood near the coffee station, industrial brewer, generic beans, creamer in individual plastic containers, and felt profoundly out of place. Then Daniel walked in. He moved carefully, the walking boot making his gait uneven, and stopped when he saw her. Something crossed his face, surprise, maybe concern, before settling back into professional neutrality. "Ms. Langford." "Mr. Brooks, how's the ankle?" "Better? The physical therapy is helping." They stood in the break room while conversations continued around them in careful whispers. Victoria was acutely aware of how this looked. The billionaire CEO talking to a night shift kitchen worker, both of them clearly uncomfortable with the attention this generated. "Could I speak with you privately?" Victoria asked. Daniel nodded, grabbed his water bottle from his locker, and followed her out into the hallway. The door closed behind them, muffling the speculation that undoubtedly erupted the moment they left. "Is something wrong?" Daniel asked. "No, I just wanted to check on your recovery, make sure the modified duty is actually being implemented." "It is. Marcus has been good about keeping me on prep work and plating. Nothing that requires extended standing." Daniel studied her face with that uncomfortable perceptiveness he seemed to possess. "But that's not really why you're here." Victoria felt herself being read, analyzed, seen in a way that made her feel exposed. "No," she admitted, "that's not really why I'm here." "Then why?" "Because I've spent 3 days questioning everything I thought I knew about how to live. Because my father called and told me I was making a mistake, and for the first time in my life I think he's wrong. Because watching you put your daughter first when I told you that you were fired cracked something open in my chest that I don't know how to close." "I wanted to apologize," Victoria said instead, "for the psychological experiment, for using your employment status as a variable in some study about human behavior under stress. It was unethical, and I've been thinking about it more since then, about how that must have felt, even if it was only for a few minutes." Daniel leaned against the wall, taking weight off his injured ankle. "It felt like the end of everything, like watching my daughter's future disappear, like failing the one person who depends on me completely." He said it matter-of-factly, without accusation, just stating truth. "But it wasn't real, so I've tried not to dwell on it. Except it was real for you in that moment. The fear was real. The calculations you must have made, rent, bills, medication, how long before everything collapsed, those were real." "Yes." Daniel's eyes met hers. "They were. I'm sorry, genuinely sorry. I was treating you like a research subject instead of a human being with a child who depends on you. That was wrong." Something shifted in Daniel's expression. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. Why are you apologizing now? It's been weeks. Because I'm trying to figure out how to be a different person than my father trained me to be. And apologizing for actual harm I've caused seems like a reasonable starting point. Daniel nodded slowly. Your father sounds difficult. That's diplomatic. Victoria's laugh came out harsh. He's brilliant, strategic, completely emotionally unavailable, and he taught me that attachment was weakness and caring about people was the fastest way to get hurt. And for 34 years, I believed him completely. What changed? You, Victoria wanted to say. You asked me not to tell your daughter about a crisis I'd manufactured, and something in that request revealed everything my father's philosophy had cost me. But that felt too raw, too honest, too much like vulnerability in a hallway where any staff member could walk by at any moment. I'm not sure, Victoria said instead. Maybe nothing changed. Maybe I'm just finally admitting what I've always known, but was too afraid to acknowledge. Before Daniel could respond, the break room door opened and another kitchen worker emerged, a young woman Victoria vaguely recognized from the late shift. She saw them, her eyes widening slightly, then hurried past with a mumbled greeting. You should go, Victoria said. People are going to talk. People are already talking. Daniel straightened from the wall. But you're right. My break is almost over anyway. He started to leave, then paused. Ms. Langford? The apology. Thank you. That took courage. Victoria watched him walk back toward the break room, the walking boot creating an uneven rhythm against the tile floor, and felt something warm unfold in her chest. Daniel Brooks thought she had courage. A man who'd survived his wife's death, who was raising a child alone while working exhausting shifts and living on nothing, who'd faced what he believed was sudden unemployment with dignity instead of desperation. That man thought she had courage. The observation felt simultaneously undeserved and essential, like water after years of not realizing she'd been thirsty. That night, Victoria made another impulsive decision. She pulled up Daniel's personnel file again, noted his address in Queens, and spent 20 minutes on real estate websites looking at neighborhoods she'd never visited. Woodside, Jackson Heights, Elmhurst. Areas of the city that existed outside her Manhattan-centric universe, where working-class families raised children and built lives on incomes that seemed impossible to survive on. Daniel's building looked tired on Google Street View, beige brick, fire escapes adding vertical lines like scars, small windows that suggested small apartments behind them. This was where he lived, where Lily grew up, where they built their life from the wreckage of Emma's death, and somehow kept going despite mathematics that shouldn't have allowed it. Victoria had 3 bedrooms in her Tribeca penthouse. She'd converted one into a home office she rarely used. The other served as a guest room for guests who never came. 6,000 square feet for one person, while Daniel and Lily shared a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. The inequality shouldn't have bothered her. Victoria believed in meritocracy, in market efficiency, in the fundamental principle that wealth flowed to those who created value. She'd earned her money through intelligence and strategic thinking. Daniel worked in a kitchen. The salary difference reflected that reality. But watching him limp back to work with his walking boot, knowing he'd been calculating medical costs against his daughter's medication budget, had revealed something her economics textbooks had never addressed. The fact that dignity and value weren't the same thing as market compensation. Daniel Brooks had dignity. He had value. He had qualities Victoria was beginning to suspect mattered more than anything on a balance sheet. And he had approximately $6 in his bank account after paying bills. The cognitive dissonance was making Victoria's carefully constructed worldview crack down the middle. The following week brought December's first major snowstorm, the kind of weather that transformed New York into a beautiful, inconvenient mess. Victoria watched from her office window as snow accumulated on streets below, covering everything in white that would turn gray and slushy within hours. Her assistant called, Ms. Langford, several staff members are requesting to leave early due to the weather. Transit is already experiencing delays, and the forecast is predicting another 6 inches before evening. Approve all early departure requests, and make sure everyone on the evening shift knows they can call in without penalty if they can't get in safely. Of course. I'll send the message now. Victoria returned to her window, watching the snow fall with an intensity that suggested personal vendetta against the city. The smart thing would be to go home, to drive her Tesla back to Tribeca before the roads became truly dangerous. But something kept her in the office, working through reports and strategic planning documents while snow continued its assault outside. At 8:47 p.m., her office phone rang. Not her direct line, the general facilities number that routed through the security desk. "Ms. Langford, this is Frank at the front desk. We have a situation developing that I thought you should know about." Victoria's chest tightened. "What kind of situation?" "One of our kitchen staff, Daniel Brooks. His daughter's school called. Apparently the after-school program closed early due to weather, but Mr. Brooks didn't get the message. His childcare provider can't make it to the school because of transit delays, and the school can't reach him because his phone died during his shift." "Where's Mr. Brooks now?" "In the kitchen. He doesn't know yet. The school called the emergency contact number on file, which routes to us when the primary contact can't be reached." Victoria was already moving, grabbing her coat. "Tell Mr. Brooks I'm on my way down. Tell him not to leave until I get there." Yes, she took the elevator down 43 floors with her heart beating too fast and her mind running calculations. Daniel's daughter alone at school, after-hours staff probably trying to reach parents, Lily frightened and confused, Daniel working a shift completely unaware that his childcare had collapsed. The kitchen was chaos when Victoria arrived. Steam, noise, Marcus calling orders while staff scrambled to prep for a private event. Daniel stood at a prep station carefully chopping vegetables with his back to the door. "Mr. Brooks." He turned, saw her, and something in his expression shifted immediately. "What's wrong?" "Your daughter's school called. The after-school program closed early due to weather. Your childcare provider can't get there, and the school hasn't been able to reach you." All color drained from Daniel's face. "My phone died. I forgot to charge it last night." His hands started shaking. "Lily's alone?" "The school staff is with her. She's safe. But they need you to pick her up." "I can't. My shift doesn't end until midnight, and Marcus is already short-staffed because of the weather." Daniel's voice was climbing toward panic. "I don't have anyone else. Mrs. Chen can't make it in this snow, and I don't have money for an emergency car service, and—" "I'll take you," Victoria said. Daniel stared at her. "What?" "I'll drive you to the school, we'll pick up Lily, and I'll take you both home. You're in no condition to navigate public transit in a snowstorm with a 6-year-old and a sprained ankle." "Ms. Langford, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering." Victoria looked at Marcus, who'd been watching this exchange with obvious fascination. "Mr. Brooks needs to leave immediately. Family emergency. I'm taking responsibility for the coverage gap." Marcus nodded slowly. "Go, Danny. Family first." Daniel grabbed his coat, moving with the jerky urgency of someone whose carefully constructed childcare infrastructure had just collapsed. He followed Victoria to the parking garage where her Tesla waited, and they drove into a snowstorm that was rapidly transforming from inconvenient to dangerous. The streets were chaos, cars sliding on unplowed roads, traffic lights swinging in wind, visibility dropping as snow continued its relentless accumulation. Victoria gripped the steering wheel with both hands, navigating carefully while Daniel sat rigid in the passenger seat, his jaw clenched tight enough that Victoria could see the muscle jumping. "She's going to be scared," Daniel said quietly. "She doesn't handle changes in routine well, not since Emma died. Any disruption makes her anxious." "Then we'll get there as fast as safely possible." The school was in Astoria, a tired-looking building with bright murals painted on walls that seemed to be fighting a losing battle against weather and time. A few lights glowed in windows, and Victoria pulled into the loading zone where a sign declared, "No parking except for authorized vehicles." "I don't think they'll ticket you," Daniel said with something that might have been humor under less stressful circumstances. They hurried inside, snow swirling around them, and found a woman in her 50s waiting in the front office. She looked tired and relieved in equal measure. "Mr. Brooks, thank goodness. Lily's been very brave, but she's been asking for you." "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Patterson. My phone died and I didn't get the message." "It's fine. Weather happens. She's in the library with Ms. Chen." They found Lily sitting at a small table, coloring with fierce concentration. She looked up when they entered, and her face transformed from carefully controlled calm to pure relief. "Daddy!" She launched herself at Daniel, who caught her and lifted her despite his ankle, holding her tight while she wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder. Victoria watched them and felt something twist in her chest. The visceral reality of love, the fierce protectiveness that made a man work through injuries and exhaustion, the bond that made a 6-year-old's entire world feel safe again just from being held. This was what mattered, not quarterly reports or acquisition strategies or market dominance. The simple, profound connection between a father and daughter who'd survived loss together and were still surviving, day by difficult day. "I'm sorry, baby girl," Daniel murmured into Lily's hair. "I'm so sorry. My phone died and I didn't know." "I wasn't scared," Lily said, voice muffled against his shoulder. "Ms. Chen read me stories and Mrs. Patterson gave me hot chocolate. But I missed you. I missed you too." Lily finally pulled back, looking at her father's face with that perceptiveness children develop when they've learned that adults aren't invincible. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay. I promise." Then Lily noticed Victoria standing near the door, and her eyes widened. "Who's that?" "This is Ms. Langford. She works at my job. She drove me here to pick you up." Lily studied Victoria with the unfiltered assessment of childhood. "You're very pretty. Like a princess, but with a suit instead of a dress." Victoria felt herself smile despite the situation. "Thank you. You're pretty too, and brave. Mrs. Patterson said you were very brave while you waited." "I was a little scared," Lily admitted. "But I remembered what Daddy always tells me. Scared is okay, but quitting isn't, so I just waited and did coloring." Daniel's eyes were suspiciously bright. He set Lily down carefully, took her coat from Mrs. Patterson and helped his daughter into it while Ms. Chen and Mrs. Patterson made the standard remarks about weather and safety and children's resilience. Then they were back outside, snow falling heavier now, visibility down to maybe 50 feet. Victoria opened the back door of her Tesla and Lily climbed in with the kind of wonder children reserve for experiencing something new. "Daddy, this car is so fancy. It has screens everywhere." "Buckle up, baby girl." The drive to Queens took 40 minutes through streets that should have taken 15. Victoria navigated carefully while Lily chattered from the back seat. Her earlier fear transformed into excitement about the adventure. Daniel sat quietly beside Victoria, his jaw still tight, one hand gripping the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, voice low enough that Lily wouldn't hear from the back seat. "This isn't your responsibility." "Stop apologizing. I shouldn't have put you in this position." "Daniel." Victoria used his first name deliberately, and he looked at her in surprise. "You didn't put me in any position. Your childcare collapsed through no fault of yours. I offered help. That's what people do." "Not in my experience." The words were said without self-pity, just observation, and Victoria felt their weight. Daniel Brooks had learned that help wasn't guaranteed, that survival meant not counting on anyone, that asking for assistance was dangerous because disappointment hurt worse than managing alone. "Then your experience has been inadequate," Victoria said. They arrived at Daniel's building, the same one Victoria had looked up on Google Street View, but somehow sadder in person, the snow failing to romanticize the tired brick and cracked concrete. She pulled up to the front entrance, and Daniel unbuckled, then opened the back door to help Lily out. "Can you say thank you to Ms. Langford?" Daniel prompted. "Thank you very much for driving us in the snowstorm," Lily said with the careful enunciation of a child who'd been taught manners. "You're very nice. Daddy says nice people are rare treasures, so you must be a treasure." Victoria's throat tightened unexpectedly. "You're welcome, Lily. Take care of your dad." "I always do." Lily said it with complete seriousness, and Victoria believed her. Daniel met Victoria's eyes over the car roof. "Thank you, really, for everything. The medical care, the modified duty, this. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't repay kindness, Daniel. You just accept it. And maybe, someday, you pass it forward to someone else who needs it." He nodded, then led Lily toward the building entrance, his walking boot creating uneven tracks in the fresh snow. Victoria watched them disappear inside, then sat in her car for a long moment, engine running, heat blasting, snow accumulating on her windshield. Something fundamental had shifted. She'd spent her entire adult life believing her father's philosophy. that attachment was weakness, that caring made you vulnerable, that strength meant surviving alone, but driving through a snowstorm to rescue a scared 6-year-old hadn't felt weak. It had felt like the strongest thing Victoria had ever done, and she wanted more of it. More connection, more meaning, more of whatever this was that made her chest feel both tight and expansive simultaneously. Victoria drove home through snow that showed no signs of stopping, and for the first time in years, her penthouse didn't feel like sanctuary. It felt like exactly what it was: expensive, empty space that reflected success but contained no actual life. She stood at her window, looking down at the snow-covered city, and made a decision. She was done surviving. She wanted to start living. And somehow, impossibly, Daniel Brooks and his brave 6-year-old daughter had shown her what that might look like. The snow continued through the night, and Victoria stood at her window until nearly 3 in the morning, watching the city disappear beneath white that looked pure until it touched the ground. She kept thinking about Lily's small voice saying, "Daddy says nice people are rare treasures." Kept seeing Daniel's face when he'd realized his daughter was stranded. Kept feeling the weight of that moment when she'd made the choice to help, instead of maintaining the professional distance her father had always insisted was essential. Sleep, when it finally came, was restless and full of dreams she couldn't quite remember upon waking except for the emotional residue they left behind. A sense of urgency, of time running out, of standing at a crossroads where every direction led somewhere irreversible. Her alarm went off at 6:30. Victoria silenced it and lay in her enormous bed in her empty bedroom, staring at a ceiling that cost more to install than most people earned in a year. The penthouse was silent, except for the ambient hum of expensive climate control, the soft tick of a vintage clock she'd purchased at auction, the profound absence of any human sound that might suggest she wasn't completely alone. She thought about Daniel and Lily waking up in their one-bedroom apartment in Queens. Lily probably climbed into her father's bed at some point during the night. That's what children did after scary experiences, Victoria had read somewhere. Daniel probably didn't sleep much, his mind cycling through all the ways his carefully constructed childcare infrastructure could collapse again, all the precarious calculations that kept them housed and fed and functioning. Victoria got up, showered, dressed in her usual armor of tailored suit and expensive heels, and drove to Meridian Tower through streets that sanitation crews had worked all night to clear. The building felt different as she rode the elevator to the 43rd floor. Or maybe she felt different, and the building was just reflecting that internal shift back at her. She had 3 board meetings scheduled, 2 conference calls with potential acquisition targets, and a mountain of paperwork requiring her signature. Instead, she pulled up Daniel's personnel file again and stared at numbers that suddenly felt obscene. His salary, his medical debt, the careful notation about his modified duty status and physical therapy schedule. Her intercom buzzed. "Ms. Langford, your 9 o'clock is here." "Cancel it." "I'm sorry?" "Cancel the meeting. Cancel everything today except the emergency board call at 3. "I need time to think." Her assistant's voice carried careful professionalism that couldn't quite mask surprise. "Of course, Ms. Langford. Should I provide a reason to the board members?" "Tell them I'm conducting strategic review. They'll understand that." Victoria ended the call and sat in her office chair, fingers steepled, mind working through a problem that wasn't actually a problem but felt like one anyway. She cared about Daniel Brooks, not as an employee, not as a research subject, not as an interesting case study in human behavior under stress. She cared about him as a person. She cared about his daughter. She wanted them to be okay in a way that had nothing to do with productivity metrics or corporate welfare programs. This was dangerous. This was exactly what her father had warned her about: emotional attachment that compromised rational decision-making, caring that created vulnerability, connection that could be weaponized against her. But it was also the first thing in years that had made Victoria feel genuinely alive. Her phone rang. Not her office line, her personal cell, the number only a handful of people possessed. She glanced at the screen. Richard Langford. Victoria let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hello, Father. We need to talk about your recent behavior." No preamble, no greeting. "I've been hearing concerning reports from board members. Canceled meetings, erratic decision-making, inappropriate personal involvement with lower-level staff." Inappropriate? Victoria's voice went cold. Define inappropriate. You drove a kitchen worker and his daughter home during a snowstorm. You've been visiting facilities areas, engaging in casual conversation with support staff, making decisions that prioritize sentiment over strategic advantage. This isn't like you, Victoria. This is weakness masquerading as compassion. How do you know about the snowstorm? But Victoria already knew the answer. Her father maintained informants throughout Meridian Tower. People who reported back to him, keeping him apprised of his daughter's activities even years after his official retirement. I know everything that happens in my company. It's not your company anymore. I bought you out 3 years ago. I built that company from nothing. I taught you everything you know. And now I'm watching you throw it away because you've developed some misguided attachment to a single father who probably sees you as nothing more than an opportunity for advancement. The accusation landed like a slap. Victoria's hand tightened on her phone. You don't know him. You don't know anything about his character or his motivations. I know human nature. I know that people in desperate situations will use whatever advantages present themselves. This man sees a billionaire CEO paying unusual attention to him. You think he's not calculating how to leverage that? You think he's not already planning how to extract maximum benefit from your sentimentality? Daniel isn't like that. Everyone is like that when survival is at stake. That's the lesson you seem to have forgotten. Richard's voice softened slightly, taking on the tone he used when he thought he was being kind. Victoria, I'm not your enemy here. I'm trying to protect you from making a catastrophic error in judgment. This kind of emotional involvement never ends well. It compromises your authority, it invites exploitation, and it will ultimately hurt both you and this family you've become so fixated on. What if you're wrong? The question came out quieter than Victoria intended. What if the catastrophic error was spending 34 years believing that surviving alone was strength instead of just elaborate cowardice? Silence. Then, I raised you better than this. Maybe that's the problem. Victoria ended the call before her father could respond, her hands trembling slightly with adrenaline and something that felt like grief. She'd just definitively chosen a path that diverged from everything her father had taught her, everything she'd believed about herself and the world. There was no going back from this. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Ms. Langford, this is Daniel Brooks. I'm sorry to contact you directly. Security gave me your number for emergencies. My daughter is asking if the nice princess lady would like to have dinner with us to say thank you for yesterday. I told her you're very busy, but Lily is quite insistent. No pressure to say yes. I understand if this crosses professional boundaries. Victoria stared at the message for a long moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Lily had called her a princess. Lily wanted to say thank you. Daniel was giving her an out, acknowledging the professional boundary issue, making it easy to decline. She typed, I would be honored. When? The response came quickly. Tonight? 6 p.m.? I know it's short notice. Lily insisted I ask right away before you got too busy. Our address is 4715 39th Avenue, Apt 3C. I'll be there. Victoria set her phone down and stared at her office door, behind which existed the entire corporate infrastructure she'd built, the board members who expected her to prioritize profit over people, the father who believed she was making a catastrophic mistake. On this side of the door sat a woman who'd spent 3 decades perfecting the art of emotional distance and was now accepting a dinner invitation from a man she barely knew and his 6-year-old daughter. The woman on this side of the door was terrified, but she was also, for the first time in memory, genuinely curious about what came next. Victoria spent the rest of the day in a strange state of distraction, moving through conference calls and document reviews while part of her mind obsessively planned for dinner. What did you bring to a 6-year-old's dinner party? What did you wear to a queen's apartment that wasn't condescending? How did you interact with a child when you'd spent your entire adult life avoiding situations that required authentic emotion? At 4:30, she left the office, an unheard-of early departure that would definitely reach her father's informants. She stopped at a bakery in Tribeca that made elaborate custom cakes, then stood in front of the display case feeling paralyzed by options. Can I help you? The woman behind the counter looked kind, patient. I need something for a 6-year-old girl, for dinner, to say thank you. Does she have favorite colors, favorite characters? Victoria realized she knew nothing about Lily's preferences. I don't know, something that would make a child happy? The woman smiled. I have a princess castle cake, pink and purple, edible glitter, little sugar flowers. Most 6-year-olds lose their minds over it. Perfect. I'll take it. The cake cost $180, which was insane for what amounted to flour and sugar. Victoria paid without thinking about it, then drove to Queens with a castle cake secured in her passenger seat like precious cargo. The building looked different in daylight, still tired, still weathered, but somehow less depressing. Children's artwork decorated a few windows. Someone had shoveled the front walk. A handwritten sign near the entrance announced a building potluck next month. Victoria climbed 3 flights with the castle cake, her heels clicking against worn linoleum, her heart beating faster than the physical exertion warranted. She found apartment 3C and knocked before she could second-guess herself. The door opened immediately. Lily stood there in a purple dress that was slightly too big, her hair in 2 careful braids, her face lighting up with pure joy. The princess lady came. Daddy, she came! Daniel appeared behind his daughter, and Victoria's breath caught. He'd changed out of his work clothes into dark jeans and a button-down shirt that was probably his version of formal wear. His hair was damp from a recent shower. He looked exhausted and nervous and genuinely glad to see her. Miss Langford, thank you for coming. Please, come in. Victoria stepped into their apartment and was immediately struck by how small it was. The entire space would have fit inside her living room with area left over. But it was also warm, lived in, full of small details that spoke of actual life. Lily's drawings covering one wall, books stacked on every available surface, a worn couch with mismatched throw pillows, photographs in cheap frames showing Daniel and Emma and baby Lily in happier times. This was a home. Victoria's penthouse was real estate. The difference was painfully obvious. I brought cake, Victoria said, holding up the bakery box. I hope that's okay. I wasn't sure what to bring. Lily's eyes went wide. Can I see? Victoria knelt down, difficult in her pencil skirt and heels, but she managed, and opened the box. Lily gasped with the kind of unfiltered delight that adults had trained themselves out of. It's a castle, with flowers. Daddy, look, it's a whole castle. Daniel crouched beside his daughter, and Victoria saw his expression shift as he processed what she'd brought, an elaborate, expensive cake for a simple dinner, the kind of thing that probably cost more than his weekly grocery budget. Ms. Langford, that's too much. It's just cake, Victoria said, even though they both knew it wasn't just cake. It was an overture, an apology, a gesture that acknowledged she had resources and wanted to share them in ways that didn't feel like charity. Can we eat it now? Lily asked. Please. After dinner, baby girl, Miss Langford came for dinner. The dinner itself was simple. Spaghetti with meat sauce, garlic bread, salad. Daniel had clearly put effort into the presentation. Cloth napkins that didn't quite match, a small vase with grocery store flowers, plates arranged carefully on their small table. Victoria sat in a chair that wobbled slightly and ate food that probably cost less than $10 total to prepare and felt more genuine hospitality than she'd experienced at 1,000 business dinners in restaurants where entrees cost 3 figures. Lily talked non-stop, a stream of consciousness narrative about school and friends, and a book about dragons that she loved and wanted Victoria to know about. Daniel interjected occasionally with gentle corrections or context, but mostly he let his daughter lead the conversation while watching Victoria with an expression she couldn't quite read. You're really pretty, Lily announced halfway through dinner. Are you married? Lily, Daniel said quietly. That's personal. It's okay, Victoria said. No, Lily, I'm not married. Why not? You're so pretty, and you're nice, and you have a fancy car. Boys should want to marry you. Victoria felt herself smile despite the bizarre discomfort of relationship advice from a 6-year-old. Marriage is complicated. Sometimes people focus on work instead. My daddy works all the time, Lily said seriously, but Mrs. Chen says he should find someone nice because everybody needs somebody to love. She says love is like food. You need it to be healthy. Daniel looked like he wanted the floor to open and swallow him. Mrs. Chen has opinions about everything. Lily, eat your spaghetti. But it's true, Daddy. You said mommy made you happy, and now you're sad sometimes. I see you being sad when you think I'm sleeping. The statement hung in the air, devastating in its childish observation. Daniel's jaw tightened, and he set his fork down carefully, as though it required intense concentration. I'm okay, baby girl. I promise. Mrs. Chen says it's okay to be sad, but it's also okay to be happy again. Lily turned her serious gaze to Victoria. Do you get sad sometimes? Yes, Victoria admitted. I do. What makes you sad? Victoria thought about her father's phone call, about her empty penthouse, about 3 decades of believing that success and isolation were synonymous. Being alone, I think. Not having people who really know me. That is sad. Lily reached across the table and patted Victoria's hand with the unselfconscious compassion of childhood. But now you have us. We can be your friends, right, Daddy? Daniel met Victoria's eyes across the table. Something passed between them, acknowledgement, perhaps, of the absurdity and profound truth of his daughter's declaration. Right, he said quietly. If Ms. Langford wants friends like us. I do, Victoria said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in recent memory. After dinner, they had the castle cake, and Lily insisted on cutting it herself with Daniel's careful supervision. They ate slices on mismatched plates while Lily explained in elaborate detail the social hierarchy of her first-grade class, and Daniel occasionally interjected with translations of 6-year-old politics into adult comprehension. At 8:15, Lily's energy finally crashed. She was mid-sentence about playground equipment when a yawn overtook her, and Daniel smiled. Bedtime, baby girl. But the princess lady is here. I want to stay up. The princess lady will still be here for a few more minutes. Say goodnight. Lily came around the table and hugged Victoria with the fierce intensity of childhood affection. Thank you for the castle cake, and for saving us in the snowstorm. You're my favorite princess. Victoria's throat tightened. You're my favorite Lily. After Daniel carried his daughter to her bedroom, Victoria stood in their small living room looking at the drawings on the walls. The photographs of Emma, who'd never know her daughter would grow up calling strange women princesses. She heard Daniel's voice through the thin wall, reading a bedtime story with the kind of patient attention that suggested this was sacred ritual. When he emerged 15 minutes later, closing Lily's door carefully behind him, his expression had shifted into something more vulnerable. I'm sorry about the interrogation, Daniel said. Lily has no filter, and she's been concerned about me. 6-year-olds shouldn't have to worry about their parents' emotional states, but here we are. She loves you. That's not something to apologize for. No, but asking my boss about her relationship status at dinner probably crosses several professional boundaries. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Would you like coffee? I can make some, or we can just call it a night if you need to get back to your actual life. Coffee would be nice. They moved to the small kitchen while Daniel prepared coffee in a machine that looked older than Victoria's career. She watched him move through the space with practiced efficiency, noted the way he favored his ankle even though the walking boot was off, saw the exhaustion that lived in his posture like a permanent condition. Can I ask you something? Victoria said. Of course. That night when I told you that you were fired, you asked me not to tell Lily. Why was that your first concern? Not your bills, not your future, but whether your daughter would know? Daniel poured coffee into 2 mugs that didn't match and handed one to Victoria before answering. Because Lily has already lost so much. Her mother, her old house, half her toys because we downsized, birthday parties we can't afford, school trips I have to decline. She's 6 years old and she's already learned that life takes things away. He stopped, swallowed. I couldn't bear the idea of her also learning that her father was failing her, that I couldn't keep us stable, that we might lose our home because I lost my job. She worries about me already, way more than a child should. I wanted to spare her that fear for as long as possible. You're not failing her, Daniel. I'm barely succeeding. Every month is this calculation. Rent, utilities, food, her medication, maybe something left over for an emergency that will inevitably happen. I work 20-hour days and we still live paycheck to paycheck. She deserves better than this. She has a father who loves her completely. That's better than most children get. Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You say that like love pays rent. Love kept you standing when I told you that you were fired. Love made you ask me to protect her from knowledge of a crisis. Love is why you're working yourself to exhaustion. Victoria set her coffee down. That's not nothing, Daniel. That's everything. He looked at her then, really looked, and Victoria felt seen in a way that was simultaneously terrifying and necessary. Why are you here, Ms. Langford? And please, a real answer, not corporate responsibility or employee welfare. Why did you drive through a snowstorm to help me? Why did you come to dinner tonight? Why do you care about a kitchen worker you barely know? Victoria could deflect. She could retreat behind professional boundaries and strategic justifications. But standing in Daniel Brooks's small kitchen, drinking coffee from a mismatched mug, watching this man who'd survived grief and exhaustion and still managed to raise a daughter who believed in princesses, she found she couldn't lie. Because you asked me not to tell your daughter about a crisis I'd manufactured, and something in that request broke through 34 years of emotional training. Because watching you check Lily's knees on a sidewalk made me realize I've built my entire life on a philosophy that mistakes survival for strength and isolation for independence. Because my father raised me to believe that attachment was weakness, and you're living proof that attachment is the only thing that makes life bearable. The silence that followed felt heavy, charged with implications neither of them were quite ready to name. I'm not a project, Daniel said quietly. I'm not some noble poor person whose dignity will teach you life lessons. I'm just a man trying to raise his daughter and not drown in the process. I know that. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're a billionaire CEO who's suddenly paying attention to one of thousands of employees. That's not normal. That suggests either I'm a charity case or you're having some kind of crisis that I'm inadvertently facilitating. Maybe both. Victoria's honesty surprised her. Maybe I am having a crisis. Maybe I'm realizing that everything I thought I wanted, the empire, the power, the success, has left me completely alone. Maybe you and Lily represent something I didn't know I was missing. Connection, Daniel said. Yes. That's not fair to us. I know. We're not responsible for fixing your loneliness. I know that too. Victoria met his eyes. But maybe we could just be friends? Real friends, not boss and employee, not rich and poor, just two people who've both survived difficult things and maybe understand each other in ways that other people don't? Daniel studied her face for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled, a real smile that actually reached his eyes. Friends who occasionally rescue each other in snowstorms? And share castle cakes? That's a very specific kind of friendship. I've never done friendship before, Victoria admitted. I might be terrible at it. Well, I've been too exhausted for friendship for 2 years, so we'll figure it out together. They finished their coffee standing in his small kitchen, talking about nothing and everything. Lily's school, Daniel's physical therapy progress, Victoria's board meetings, the absurdity of Manhattan real estate versus Queens rent. Normal conversation, the kind Victoria rarely had, unencumbered by strategy or agenda. At 10:30, Victoria checked her watch. I should go. You have an early shift tomorrow. Thank you for coming. Really. Lily will talk about this for weeks. Victoria gathered her coat and purse, and Daniel walked her to the door. They stood in the small hallway, suddenly awkward, the evening shifting into something more significant than either had planned. Daniel, Victoria said, I meant what I said about friendship. If you need anything, childcare, emergencies, just someone to talk to, I'm here. That's dangerous, Daniel said quietly. Counting on people. I know, but maybe it's also necessary. She left before either of them could say anything else that might complicate the fragile thing they'd just constructed. The drive back to Manhattan felt longer than usual, the city's lights less impressive, her penthouse more obviously empty when she finally walked through the door. Victoria stood at her window, looking down at the same indifferent city, but something had fundamentally changed. She'd sat at a wobbling table in a small apartment and felt more at home than she'd ever felt in 6,000 square feet of designer perfection. She'd been called a princess by a 6-year-old who believed in the kind of goodness Victoria had trained herself out of believing existed. She'd been seen by a man who had every reason to keep her at professional distance and had instead offered the possibility of actual friendship. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number that she now recognized as Daniel's. Lily says, I have to tell you that you're welcome to come back anytime. She's already planning your next visit. Also, thank you for everything, for seeing us. That means more than you probably realize. Victoria saved his number, then typed, Thank you for letting me in. That means more than you probably realize. She sent it before she could overthink it, then stood at her window and allowed herself to feel the full weight of hope. Dangerous, complicated hope that maybe life could be something other than the elaborate survival strategy her father had taught her. Somewhere in Queens, Daniel Brooks read her message, smiled despite his exhaustion, and felt the same impossible hope taking root in soil that had been barren for 2 years. Neither of them knew that within 72 hours, everything would explode in a way that would test whether their fragile friendship could survive the real world's violent scrutiny. But for tonight, standing at their respective windows looking at the same city from different heights, they both felt something that approximated peace, and that was enough. The peace lasted exactly 48 hours. Victoria was in her office reviewing acquisition proposals when her assistant's voice came through the intercom with unusual urgency. Ms. Langford, you need to see this immediately. Margaret Chen entered carrying a tablet, her expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested terrible news delivered professionally. There's a story. It went live 20 minutes ago on Metropolitan Business Daily. The headline is Billionaire CEO's Inappropriate Relationship with Staff Member Raises Questions About Judgment and Ethics. Victoria's stomach dropped. She took the tablet and read with mounting horror. The article was accompanied by a photograph, grainy but unmistakable, of her and Daniel standing in the service hallway, the night she'd confronted him about his ankle. The angle made it look intimate, conspiratorial. Another photo showed her Tesla parked outside Daniel's building during the snowstorm, timestamp visible. The text was worse than the images. It painted Victoria as a CEO exploiting her position to pursue an inappropriate relationship with a vulnerable employee. It suggested Daniel might be manipulating the situation for financial gain. It quoted anonymous board members expressing concern about her recent erratic behavior and questioned whether she was fit to lead Meridian Capital. Her father's influence was all over this. The sources, the timing, the particular spin that made her compassion look like weakness, and Daniel's existence looked like opportunism. The board is requesting an emergency meeting, Margaret said quietly. 3 o'clock this afternoon. They're demanding an explanation. Of course they are. Victoria set the tablet down with excessive care, fighting the urge to throw it across the room. What else? Media requests for comment. 7 so far, including the Wall Street Journal. Your father called. He's left 3 messages in the past 15 minutes. Victoria closed her eyes. This was the consequence of choosing connection over isolation, of allowing herself to care about someone outside the protective barriers her father had insisted were essential. Richard Langford had warned her this would happen, had predicted exactly this kind of exploitation and public embarrassment, except he'd been wrong about who was doing the exploiting. Get me Daniel Brooks's schedule, Victoria said. I need to talk to him before this gets worse. Ms. Langford, I'm not sure direct contact is advisable right now, legally speaking. I don't care about legally speaking. Get me his schedule. Margaret retreated and Victoria sat alone in her office, staring at the article that was already being shared across social media, already generating commentary from people who knew nothing about her or Daniel or the actual circumstances of their friendship. The narrative was being written in real time. Powerful woman, vulnerable man, abusive position, questions about judgment. Her phone rang. Richard Langford, again. This time Victoria answered. I know what you did. I protected you from making a catastrophic error. Her father's voice carried no apology. You were becoming emotionally compromised, making decisions that prioritized sentiment over strategy. Someone had to intervene before you destroyed everything you'd built. So you leaked photos to the press. You manufactured a scandal to force me back into line. I provided information to journalists who were already asking questions. Your behavior has been erratic, Victoria. The board notices. Your competitors notice. I simply gave them context for what they were already observing. Victoria's hand tightened on her phone. You made Daniel look like he's exploiting me. You made me look unstable. You weaponized compassion and turned it into scandal. Because compassion in leadership is weakness. Because emotional attachment compromises judgment. Because you needed to learn this lesson before it cost you everything. Richard's voice softened slightly. Victoria, I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to save you from yourself. End this inappropriate relationship. Issue a statement reaffirming your commitment to professional boundaries. Let the board see that you understand the seriousness of the situation. You can survive this if you make the right choice now. The right choice according to you. The right choice according to reality. That man is a kitchen worker with a child to support and massive debt. You're a billionaire CEO. There is no universe in which that power dynamic isn't exploitative, regardless of who initiated what. The kindest thing you can do for both of you is end this before it destroys you both. Victoria thought about Lily calling her a princess, about Daniel's careful honesty in his small kitchen, about the way genuine friendship had felt after 34 years of strategic relationships. What if I don't want to end it? Then you'll lose your company, your reputation, and eventually this man will disappoint you the way all emotional attachments disappoint. And you'll have sacrificed everything for nothing. Or maybe I'll finally have something that actually matters. You're making a mistake, Victoria. That's my choice to make. Victoria ended the call and sat in silence, her mind racing through options and consequences. She could do what her father suggested, issue a statement, distance herself from Daniel, return to the safety of emotional isolation. The board would be satisfied. The media would move on to other scandals. Her empire would remain intact. But she would be exactly where she'd started, successful, powerful, and completely alone. Or she could fight. At 2:47 p.m., Victoria walked into the emergency board meeting with her spine straight and her expression composed. The 12 board members sat around the conference table with varying degrees of concern and judgment on their faces. Her father sat at the far end, his presence unofficial but clearly influential. Let's address this directly, Victoria said before anyone else could speak. You've all seen the article. You have questions about my judgment, my relationship with an employee, my fitness to lead this company. So let me provide clarity. She pulled up her own presentation on the conference room screen, the timeline she'd spent the past 3 hours constructing with Margaret's help. 6 months ago, I conducted a psychological experiment on Daniel Brooks, telling him he was fired to observe his response under stress. That experiment was unethical, and I've since apologized for it. 3 months ago, I implemented company-wide wage increases and benefits expansions after recognizing that many of our lower-tier employees were struggling with basic survival. Mr. Brooks was one of many who benefited from those changes. She clicked to the next slide. 2 weeks ago, I discovered Mr. Brooks was working through a significant injury because he couldn't afford medical care. I sent him to our corporate clinic, the same clinic available to all employees, and ensured he received appropriate treatment. 1 week ago, during a snowstorm, Mr. Brooks's childcare arrangements collapsed. I drove him to pick up his 6-year-old daughter because it was the right thing to do. That's an inappropriate level of personal involvement with a subordinate employee, one board member interrupted. It creates the appearance of favoritism and potential exploitation. Does it? Victoria's voice went cold. Or does it create the appearance that I actually give a damn about the people who make this company function? That I see them as human beings rather than line items on a budget? Your father warned us this would happen, another board member said, that you were becoming emotionally compromised, that your judgment was being affected by personal relationships. Victoria looked directly at Richard Langford. My father has spent his entire life believing that emotional distance equals strength, that caring about people makes you vulnerable, that attachment is weakness, and he raised me to believe the same thing. But I'm starting to understand that his philosophy isn't wisdom, it's just fear dressed up as strategy. This is exactly the kind of emotional reasoning that concerns us, Richard said. You're prioritizing sentiment over business reality. No, I'm prioritizing humanity over the kind of sociopathic capitalism that treats people as disposable resources. Victoria turned back to the full board. Daniel Brooks is a widower raising a 6-year-old daughter alone while working exhausting shifts and barely surviving. When his childcare collapsed, I helped him. When he was injured, I made sure he received medical care. When his daughter invited me to dinner as a thank you, I accepted. These aren't scandalous actions. They're basic human decency. They're also actions that create legal liability and ethical concerns, the board's legal counsel said carefully. The power dynamic between a CEO and a kitchen worker is inherently problematic. Any relationship, even friendship, can be construed as coercive or exploitative. Then perhaps we need to examine why that power dynamic exists in the first place, Victoria said. Why does a man working full-time for this company barely earn enough to survive? Why do we consider it normal that he had to choose between treating an injury and paying rent? Why is basic human compassion considered inappropriate when it crosses hierarchical boundaries? Because that's how businesses function, her father said. Hierarchy exists for reasons. Boundaries exist for reasons. You're not his friend, Victoria. You're his employer. That relationship carries responsibilities and limitations you seem determined to ignore. I'm both, Victoria said. I can be both. And if this board believes that being a CEO means I forfeit my basic humanity, that I'm required to treat everyone beneath me on the organizational chart as invisible, then maybe this isn't a board I want to serve. The silence that followed was absolute. Several board members exchanged glances. Her father's expression had gone carefully blank. Are you threatening to resign? One of the older members asked. I'm telling you that I refuse to choose between competent leadership and basic human decency. I will not apologize for helping an employee during a crisis. I will not distance myself from Daniel Brooks to satisfy some antiquated notion of professional boundaries that primarily serves to keep power concentrated and empathy optional. And if that makes me unfit to lead in your estimation, then we have fundamentally different definitions of leadership. Ms. Langford, the board chair said carefully, no one is questioning your competence or your results. But appearances matter. This article suggests inappropriate behavior. The market responds to perception as much as reality. We need to manage this situation carefully. Then let's manage it with truth, Victoria said. I'll issue a statement explaining exactly what happened. I'll be transparent about my actions and my reasoning. And I'll let the market decide whether compassion is actually a liability or if maybe, just maybe, the world is ready for a different kind of leadership. That's a significant risk, the legal counsel warned. I'm aware. Victoria looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. I'm also aware that I've spent my entire life making the safe choice, the strategic choice, the choice my father would approve of, and it's left me successful and miserable. So yes, this is a risk, but it's a risk I'm willing to take. The board meeting continued for another 90 minutes, but Victoria had already won the only victory that mattered. She'd refused to retreat. The board couldn't force her to end her friendship with Daniel, couldn't make her apologize for basic human decency, couldn't return her to the emotional isolation her father considered essential. They could fire her, they could release statements, they could try to manage the scandal, but they couldn't make her regret caring about someone. When Victoria finally left the conference room, exhausted and shaking slightly from adrenaline, Margaret was waiting with another message. Mr. Brooks called. He saw the article. He wants to talk to you immediately. Victoria's stomach clenched. This was the conversation she'd been dreading. Daniel realizing that knowing her had turned his private life into public scandal, that her attention had made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of scrutiny he couldn't afford. She drove to Queens without calling first, knowing that some conversations required presence rather than distance. The January evening was brutally cold, wind cutting through her coat as she climbed the familiar 3 flights to apartment 3C. Daniel opened the door before she could knock. His expression was carefully controlled, but Victoria could see the strain underneath, the tightness around his eyes, the set of his jaw. Behind him, she could hear Lily talking to Mrs. Chen in the living room. "We need to talk," Daniel said quietly. "But not here. Lily doesn't need to hear this." They went to the roof, a communal space Victoria hadn't known existed, empty except for a few snow-covered chairs and a view of Queens stretching toward the Manhattan skyline. Daniel closed the door behind them and turned to face her, and Victoria saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten. Hurt, mixed with resignation. "I saw the article," he said. "Actually, that's not accurate. One of my coworkers showed it to me during my shift, asking if I was sleeping with the boss for preferential treatment." Victoria felt like she'd been slapped. Daniel, it's not just the article. It's the comments, hundreds of them. People I've never met, making assumptions about my character, my motivations, whether I'm manipulating you or you're exploiting me. Someone found Emma's obituary and posted it, suggesting I'm using my tragic backstory to gain sympathy and financial advantage. His voice cracked slightly. They're talking about my dead wife, like she's a plot device in some scandal. I'm so sorry. The words felt completely inadequate. Marcus pulled me aside after the shift. He said HR is investigating potential policy violations. They're reviewing all our interactions, all the times you've helped me, trying to determine if there's been inappropriate favoritism or if I've violated ethics guidelines by accepting assistance from a superior. I'll fix this, Victoria said. I'll issue a statement. I'll explain, that's not the point. Daniel's voice rose. Then he checked himself, glancing back at the door to make sure Lily couldn't hear. Victoria, I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask you to notice me, to care about me, to drive through snowstorms or invite me to be your friend. I was surviving. That's all I've been doing for 2 years, surviving. And it wasn't good, but it was stable. It was private. Now my life is public scandal, and everyone is questioning my integrity. I know I did this to you. Victoria felt tears threatening, which was absurd. She never cried, had trained herself out of that weakness decades ago. I should have thought about the consequences. I should have maintained professional distance, like my father always told me to. I was selfish. Were you? Daniel's expression shifted. Or were you just being human? Because that's what this really is, isn't it? The world punishing us for having the audacity to care about each other across boundaries that aren't supposed to be crossed. I don't know. Victoria wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. All I know is that I saw you struggling and I couldn't ignore it. That I watched you put your daughter first and something in me broke open. That having dinner in your apartment felt more real than anything I've experienced in years. And now that honesty is being weaponized against both of us. They stood in silence for a long moment, their breath visible in the cold air, the city lights stretching before them like promises no one intended to keep. The board wants me to end this, Victoria said finally. Our friendship, whatever this is. They want me to issue a statement distancing myself from you, to prove I understand professional boundaries. What did you tell them? I told them no. Daniel looked at her sharply. Victoria, you can't sacrifice your career for what? For friendship? For basic human decency? For refusing to treat you like you're disposable? Victoria's voice strengthened. My father built his entire philosophy on the idea that caring is weakness, that attachment is vulnerability, that surviving alone is strength. But watching you survive with Lily, watching you choose connection even when it's terrifying, that's real strength. That's what I want. Not the empire, not the power, not the success that leaves me standing alone in an empty penthouse, wondering if any of it actually matters. You're romanticizing this, Daniel said quietly. I'm not some noble, poor person whose dignity will redeem you. I'm exhausted. I'm in debt. I'm barely keeping my daughter fed and safe. That's not inspiring. It's just reality. I know, but you're also brave in ways I never learned to be. You let yourself love Lily completely, even knowing you could lose her. You asked me for help during the snowstorm, even though asking for help probably terrified you. You invited me to dinner, even though that meant being vulnerable in front of someone who has power over your employment. That's not nothing, Daniel. That's everything. Daniel's eyes were bright with what might have been tears. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be your friend while also being your employee. I don't know how to navigate a world that's analyzing every interaction we have, looking for scandal or exploitation. Then we figure it out together, Victoria said. We set boundaries where we need them. We're transparent about our friendship. We accept that some people will never believe that connection across power dynamics can be genuine. But we don't let fear make our choices for us. That's easy for you to say. You're the CEO. The worst that happens to you is bad press. The worst that happens to me is losing my job, losing my apartment, losing Lily's stability. The observation landed like a physical blow. Daniel was right. Their risk wasn't equivalent. Victoria could survive scandal. Daniel couldn't survive unemployment. You're right, Victoria admitted. The power dynamic is real, and pretending it doesn't exist is naive. So here's what I'm proposing. I'm creating a new position. Director of Employee Experience and Workplace Culture. It's a senior position, reports directly to me, substantial salary increase, and it involves evaluating and improving policies around employee welfare, benefits, and workplace dignity. Daniel stared at her. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you the opportunity to do what you're already doing, surviving impossible circumstances with grace, but with actual resources to help other people do the same. You know what it's like to work while injured because you can't afford to take time off. You know what it means to calculate medication against groceries. You know how it feels to be invisible in an organization that depends on your labor. That knowledge is valuable, Daniel. I want to hire it. That looks like exactly the kind of favoritism people are accusing you of. Or it looks like recognizing talent and lived experience that this company desperately needs. I'll post the position publicly. I'll interview other candidates, but I'm telling you now that you're the most qualified person for this role, and if you want it, it's yours. Daniel turned away, looking out at the city. This is insane. Probably. My father would tell me you're manipulating me, that this is exploitation dressed up as opportunity. Your father might be right. Except he's dead, so I can't actually ask him. Daniel's laugh was harsh. Emma would have known what to do. She was always better at trusting people than I am. What do you think she would have told you? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. She would have said that scared is okay, but quitting isn't. That's what I tell Lily anyway. It's what Emma used to tell me when I was afraid of taking risks. Is that a yes? It's a let me think about it overnight. Daniel turned back to face her. But Victoria, if I do this, if I accept this position, if we figure out how to be friends across this impossible power dynamic, you need to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that Lily comes first, always. If our friendship or this job or anything else ever puts her stability at risk, I walk away. No guilt, no pressure, just immediate exit. Can you promise me that? I promise, Victoria said without hesitation. Lily's well-being is non-negotiable. Daniel nodded slowly. Then I'll think about it. I'll call you tomorrow with my answer. They stood together in the cold for another moment, and then Daniel said quietly, For what it's worth, I'm glad you noticed me. Even with all this chaos, even with the article and the scandal and everything else, I'm glad you saw me. No one's really seen me since Emma died. I forgot what that felt like. Victoria felt her throat tighten. I'm glad I noticed you too. You changed everything. So Daniel went back inside to his daughter, and Victoria drove home through streets that felt different now. Still cold, still indifferent, but somehow less hostile. She'd stood on a roof in Queens and offered a man both friendship and opportunity, not because it was strategic or because it served her interests, but because it was right. Her father would be horrified. The board would be concerned. The media would analyze it endlessly, but Victoria had finally made a choice that felt authentic rather than calculated. The next morning, Daniel called at 8 a.m. Victoria was in her office, preparing talking points for the press statement she'd decided to release. I accept, Daniel said without preamble. The position. I accept. You're sure? No. But Emma used to say that being sure is overrated, that sometimes you just have to trust the person who sees you and hope they're seeing something real. I'm seeing something real, Victoria promised. Then let's do this. But Victoria? We do it right. Public posting, real interviews, transparent process. I don't want anyone to be able to claim I got this job because we're friends. Agreed. 3 weeks later, Metropolitan Business Daily ran a follow-up story. This one featured interviews with Meridian Capital employees across all levels, discussing the recent policy changes, the wage increases, the benefits expansions. Several people mentioned Daniel Brooks by name, not as scandal or exploitation, but as someone who understood their struggles because he'd lived them. The article quoted Victoria extensively from the press conference she'd held, where she'd explained her actions with unflinching honesty. I saw an employee in crisis and I helped. That's not scandal, it's basic humanity. If the business world considers compassion inappropriate, then perhaps we need to reconsider what we value in leadership. The board had been furious. Her father had stopped speaking to her entirely. Several major shareholders had expressed concern, but employee retention had increased 17%. Productivity was up. And for the first time in Meridian Capital's history, staff surveys reported feeling valued rather than exploited. On a Friday evening in late February, Victoria stood in Meridian Tower's newly completed rooftop garden, a space she'd commissioned after learning that several employees had young children with nowhere safe to play near their apartments. The garden featured playground equipment, benches for parents, small plots where families could grow vegetables if they wanted. It had been Daniel's idea, his first major initiative in his new role. "The board still thinks I'm insane," Victoria said, as Daniel approached with Lily, who immediately ran toward the swings with the kind of uninhibited joy only children possessed. "The board thinks profit and humanity are mutually exclusive," Daniel replied. "They're wrong. Are they? We spent $250,000 on this garden. That's money that doesn't directly generate return. It generates retention. It generates loyalty. It generates the kind of workplace where people actually want to show up." Daniel smiled. "Besides, watch your goddaughter. Tell me that's not return on investment." Victoria watched Lily swing higher, her laughter carrying across the rooftop, and felt something warm unfold in her chest. She was Lily's godmother now, a role she'd accepted with terrifying seriousness after Daniel had asked her 3 weeks ago. The responsibility felt enormous and essential, a connection that bound her to this makeshift family in ways that had nothing to do with power dynamics or professional boundaries. "My father still isn't speaking to me," Victoria said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'm not." Victoria turned to Daniel. "He was right about one thing, though. Caring about you did change everything. I lost his approval, lost the relationship we had, lost the version of myself he trained me to be." "Regrets?" "None." Victoria smiled. "Turns out his version of me was surviving, but not living. I prefer living." Lily ran back over, breathless and glowing. "Victoria, come swing with me. Daddy says you don't know how to play, so I'm going to teach you." "I don't know how to play?" "Daddy says you spent too much time working and not enough time being happy. But that's okay. I'm an excellent teacher." Victoria glanced at Daniel, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I may have said something like that." "Come on!" Lily grabbed Victoria's hand, pulling her toward the swings with 6-year-old determination. "I'll teach you everything. First swinging, then monkey bars, then how to make the slide more fun by going down backwards." Victoria allowed herself to be pulled across the rooftop garden, leaving Daniel standing near the vegetable plots with an expression of amused affection. She sat on a swing that was slightly too small, her designer suit completely inappropriate for playground equipment, and let Lily push her while explaining the proper technique for maximum height. Below them, Manhattan glittered with its usual indifference. Meridian Tower stretched 43 floors down to street level, where thousands of employees worked in offices and kitchens and maintenance spaces, building an empire that Victoria had once thought was the point of everything. But the point wasn't the empire. It never had been. The point was this: a 6-year-old girl teaching a billionaire CEO how to swing, a widowed father watching his daughter laugh with someone who'd become family, a rooftop garden built because someone cared enough to ask what people actually needed rather than what looked impressive on architectural plans. The point was connection, was choosing people over fear, was understanding that real strength wasn't surviving alone, it was having the courage to build something together. Victoria swung higher, and Lily's delighted laughter echoed across the rooftop. And for the first time in 34 years, Victoria Langford felt like she was finally, genuinely, completely alive. 6 months later, Daniel stood in Victoria's office with a proposal. "I want to expand the employee assistance program. Not just crisis management, but proactive support, financial literacy classes, subsidized childcare, mental health resources, career development for positions that usually get ignored in advancement planning." "Budget?" Victoria asked. "Significant. $2 million annually to start, scaling up as we refine the program." The board will resist. They always do. But we have 6 months of data showing that investing in employee welfare improves every metric they actually care about. And more importantly, it's the right thing to do. Victoria smiled. "You sound like me now. That's dangerous." "You sound like me. That's revolutionary." The program launched 3 months later. Other companies noticed. Business publications ran features. Victoria did interviews where she explained her philosophy, that capitalism and compassion weren't opposites, that employee welfare was good business, that maybe the future of corporate leadership looked less like her father and more like humans actually taking care of each other. Some people called her naive. Others called her a visionary. Victoria didn't particularly care what they called her. She cared that Lily was thriving in second grade, that Daniel had been promoted again to VP of Employee Experience, that the rooftop garden had a waiting list of families wanting access, that employee retention at Meridian Capital was the highest in the industry. She cared that she'd chosen connection over isolation and survived the choice intact. On a December evening, 1 year after the scandal that had almost destroyed them both, Victoria, Daniel, and Lily stood in the rooftop garden watching snow fall across Manhattan. They'd become experts at this, standing together in the cold, watching the city, building a life from the wreckage of everything they'd thought they understood about power and survival and what actually mattered. "My teacher asked what I'm grateful for," Lily said, watching snowflakes accumulate on her purple mittens. "I said I'm grateful for my daddy and for Victoria, because they taught me that family isn't just the people you're born with. It's the people who show up when you're scared and stay, even when it's hard." Daniel's eyes were bright. Victoria's throat felt tight. "You're wiser than any adult I know," Victoria said. "Mrs. Chen says that too." Lily looked up at both of them with complete seriousness. "She also says you should get married because you obviously love each other, but I told her you're just friends, and that's okay too. Love has lots of shapes." Victoria and Daniel exchanged glances over Lily's head, amused, slightly mortified, touched by 6-year-old wisdom that saw things adults tried to complicate. "Mrs. Chen has a lot of opinions," Daniel said diplomatically. "But she's not wrong about love having lots of shapes," Victoria added. "Your dad and I are family. That's a kind of love too." "The best kind," Lily declared with the confidence of someone who'd learned early that family was what you built, not just what you inherited. They stood together as snow continued to fall, 3 people who'd been strangers 18 months ago and were now permanently woven into each other's lives. Victoria had lost her father's approval and gained a makeshift family. Daniel had risked everything on impossible friendship and found security he'd thought was impossible. Lily had gained a godmother who showed up at school plays and helped with homework and loved her fiercely, despite having no practice at loving anyone. Victoria thought about that night when she'd told Daniel he was fired, when his first response had been to protect his daughter from knowledge of crisis. That moment had cracked open something in her chest that had stayed open ever since. The dangerous, essential capacity to care about people even when caring made you vulnerable. Her father had been wrong. Attachment wasn't weakness. Isolation wasn't strength. Surviving alone wasn't victory. It was just elaborate loneliness dressed up as success. Real strength was standing on a rooftop in the snow with a man who'd taught you about dignity and a child who'd taught you about joy, building something that looked nothing like empire but felt exactly like home. "I love you both," Victoria said quietly. "I just wanted you to know that." Lily hugged her immediately. Daniel's hand found hers and squeezed. "We love you too," he said, "even when you don't know how to swing properly." "I'm improving." "You're terrible," Lily said cheerfully. "But that's okay. We love you anyway." They went inside as snow fell harder, transforming the city into something beautiful and temporary. Tomorrow, Victoria would return to board meetings and strategic planning and all the machinery of building an empire. But tonight, she was just someone who'd learned that the best things in life weren't built alone. That scared was okay, but quitting wasn't. That real treasure wasn't measured in quarterly reports. That sometimes, the strongest thing you could do was admit you needed people and let them need you back. Victoria looked at Daniel and Lily heading toward the elevator and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. She'd been taught her entire life that power meant standing alone. But power, real power, was standing with people who saw you completely and chose to stay anyway. That was the empire worth building. That was the legacy that actually mattered. Not the tower, not the money, not the quarterly profits. Just this. 3 people who'd chosen each other across every boundary that said they shouldn't, and built something unshakable from courage and trust and the radical act of caring. Victoria followed them into the elevator, and as the doors closed on another day, she allowed herself to feel completely, terrifyingly, wonderfully alive. She was home.